and something is happening with YouTube. Something's connecting. And it would appear that we are live on YouTube on a Friday night. Ladies and gents, after another grueling week at work, or perhaps on holiday with the wife or husband that you kick yourself every day for settling down with, you have reached the end of the working week and your tether, and chosen to spend your Friday night unwinding with me. Unfortunately, that is just the most recent of your catalogue of poor decisions, as you will find out over the next hour, as we fail spectacularly to cheer you up for the weekend and instead dive headfirst into our specialist subject of pain, dystopia and political chaos. Joining me for this week's jolly bout of uplifting tinkery is property journalist Harry Scoffin. Welcome, Harry. Woo!
Hi there. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. How you doing, man?
Good, not bad. Busy week for me, but it's nice to have a breather and we can have a sit-down chat tonight, which is good.
Yeah, we were just sort of saying before we started streaming that we were trying to do this, for about a month or 2 months before?
A month, yeah, that was it. I lost my voice from all this chatting because I'm a journalist, you're speaking to people all the
Yeah,
time, and then you came down with COVID,
that's
didn't
right.
you?
Yeah, and then my girlfriend had it, and then both my kids had it, and so yeah, but
What family out,
we've
yeah.
made it happen finally. But it's one of these things like when you connect with people on Twitter and you don't really we don't really know each other, and it's
No,
just sort of direct messaging and stuff. I,
slid into the DMs there, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but you never know if people are just kind of full of shit or not. So I was worried that you would be
True.
thinking,
You're never 100% about the person behind the account, really, do you?
yeah, but I don't know. I was worried that you might think that I was messing you around. Oh, yeah, we'll do it in like four
Oh,
weeks or
no
yeah, yeah.
way.
Um,
Because remember, I was like, we got to delay it because I literally couldn't speak. It sounded like, I don't know, Freddy Krueger or something, or Rod Stewart. I don't know. The voice was all over the place.
yeah, yeah.
So,
That's good. Well, I mean, you're sounding good tonight, so I assume you've done your vocal warm ups and stuff
thanks.
before we did start.
Yeah, honey and lemon tea, lots of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, yeah, thanks very much for joining us. I suppose the reason that I thought you would be a great guest to get on was because anyone who follows me on TikTok, or anyone who has had the misfortune to be bored by me at a dinner party, will know that the housing crisis is a subject close to my heart. And full disclosure, I'm a homeowner. I've by hook or by crook managed to get myself on the ladder. But I'm acutely aware of the challenges that people face within it, broadly speaking. Uh, so we can touch a little bit on that sort of broad housing crisis in a
Yeah.
while. But one of the things that drew me to you was your the attention that you give and the exposure that you give, specifically to the cladding and leaseholder
Yeah.
scandal. So obviously you share a lot of content on Twitter, and you've written a lot of stuff about it. And I think that's really interesting, and it deserves a mention, because it's still ongoing. I think in a lot of people's minds,
Yeah.
they think, oh, Grenfell happened, and that was really sad, and we've had this inquiry, and maybe now it's time to, but it's like, no, this is still, the ripple effects from this is still happening. So I thought, let's have a chat about that. Let's try and give, in the meager and humble way that I can, let's try and give it a little bit more exposure and put it to pieces.
100%. Well, thanks for having me on because I think, as you said, you've got a personal interest in this. So do I. Even though I'm not a homeowner,
Mm,
I'm only 26. The reality is my mum is a leaseholder and she's been completely rinsed on
right.
service charges. Is that basically this idea of a leasehold? I don't know whether we're going to get onto that in a minute,
Yeah.
but buying a home, you think you're going to be a homeowner, but lots of people, they're basically a glorified renter,
Mm,
but they put all this money behind a certain landlord, behind a certain building. And the reality is, at least with renting, if you're not happy with the service being provided, you can, basically move on to another property. Whereas with leasehold, you're basically owning, you take on all the responsibilities, all of the hassles of owning,
mm,
all the costs and the risks, but you have none of the control and none of the autonomy. So it's a big, big issue. But I guess in England, Wales, Scotland have abolished it years ago.
yeah.
Most of the world don't have it, but we have it because it's this kind of feudal system. It
Mm,
goes back to almost a doomsday book, which is crazy. Well, I'm sure
right.
we'll get on to it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Let's tap into that in a few minutes. I think first of all, it would be good to get an understanding of your background, because property journalism is quite a specific sort of niche area. I'm sure when you were studying journalism, or when you had desires, aspirations to get into journalism, you were probably thinking of being like the next Glenn Greenwald, or maybe not. Like, maybe it was always property. But like, how did you end up
Well,
doing
it's
what you do
funny.
now?
So my sort of background, I guess it was politics. I've read at university, did a master's at LSE, very much the politics thing.
Right.
The bug. The reality is a bit, going into politics that way, I thought you can affect change in a far more, I don't know, honest way, but also getting through journalism, not necessarily being a politician or anything like that. And I was saying about my mum's situation, that was such a crazy, well, we're still living in it, but crazy situation, not having control, and these charges just going up. 61% they've gone up in 6 years. There's
Right.
no luxury services. You've got one guy basically guarding a door who's on little more than minimum wage.
Yeah.
And, the freeholder lives on a yacht in Monaco. And I thought, well, I did a 2 weeks internship at the independent newspaper. And basically, I did a long read for them on leasehold and this leasehold scandal.
Right.
And I really was just dipping my toe in the water. And then Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, which is kind of the leaseholders charity, they also run the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament of all the MPs and peers that are, or lords that are interested in trying to get this horrible, archaic, abusive, almost corrupt system abolished,
Yeah.
and bring England and Wales into line with the rest of the world. They reached out to me and said, look, would you like to come on for some work experience? And then it's funny, I sort of never left. And sort of my main boss is Sebastian O'Kelly. He was the one of the former Mail on Sunday property editors for 12 years. So it's almost been a kind of apprenticeship almost in a way. I've sort of been the apprentice, and he's kind of been the mentor or the tutor.
Right.
And I've basically learned so much about journalism from basically working under the guy with another amazing person called Martin Boyd, who basically was a leaseholder and was up against a billionaire freeholder and managed to wrestle control of the site off him.
Right.
So there were parallels in my situation where we've got a offshore billionaire freeholder.
Yeah.
We're not probably as well organized as his block, but there we go. And sort of been there ever since. And that's been, I think, 2.5, 3 years now. So it's kind of like the laws are starting to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's kind of like I want to be part of that just before, this is a once in a, leasehold, if you know the history, it's every 10 or 15 or 20 years, laws get changed. But now I think there's a real pressure to abolish the system in a way there hasn't been in the past. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it happens.
So is it sort of like you came up, like you got your bachelor's degree, you did your master's, you did some work experience at the Independent, and the long read that they asked you to write was about leasing, or about
basically the leasehold scandal, this idea
right.
of buying a property that you actually don't own. So you're taking a mortgage out on something that you don't own.
Yeah.
So this whole thing of leasehold, basically, when you buy a flat in England and Wales, basically these flats are sold as tenancies, long-term tenancies, might be 99, may even be nearly a millennium, 999 years.
Yeah.
But the problem is that you don't have the control that you associate with home ownership.
And
so it's not like freehold ownership.
What is the justification for having that model? Because I've got friends who bought flats like pre all of this like leasehold scandal kind of hysteria,
and the Grenfell and everything.
Yeah, they like one guy bought a place in Fulham, and he explained to me that it was a 99-year lease, and I said, that's fucking weird. That's what? I thought you owned the flat. Like, why are you on a lease? And his explanation of it was, well, when you build a block of flats on, let's say, 100 square feet of land, they go upwards, right? So not everyone can own the 100 square feet that the block of flats is built on. And so what they do is there's some sort of connection there with like cutting it up into leases.
Like, so there's an argument about with the leases, you need a contract because you need to bind commitments onto the individual flat owners or tenants. And leases is something that we've had for many years now, but the leasehold system is about 1,000 years old anyway. And it actually is a feudal kind of remnant, and it's mutated into different forms. So before leasehold, we had copyhold, deeply unpopular. People rebelled against it, and then it became leasehold. And there's always a strong argument. Well, look, leasehold you'll always need because you'll need a landlord for an apartment building, multi-occupancy. You need someone to take over the interest and the stewardship of an apartment block with many different little interests. You need someone to, if the residents are fighting like rats in the sack over maybe some major works, you need someone to go above them and say, no, it's getting done. But the thing is that as anyone that studies this knows, England and Wales are among just 6 countries, they're part of the 6 that don't use common hold or a form of common hold to organise flats. So the reality is that when people buy a flat in England and Wales, you're basically buying a timeshare, or you're buying the right to occupy the
Mm,
property for a set number of years. And that means you're buying a wasting asset. So even if it's 999
mm,
years, the reality is that it can depreciate not just through the length of the lease, but you've got a landlord. Now, what the landlord does, or the freeholder they call them as well, is very important
mm.
to, the value of your property. If they don't maintain the block, the value of your lease or the value of your flat
Mm.
will go down. And the thing is,
Right.
if you can't get rid of the landlord,
Yeah.
you're in a real sticky situation there because you're in a monopoly situation.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really important point to make, because it's, I suppose, from my perspective, uh, rooted entirely of my experience of my, cherry picked one or two friends who have bought flats. They've not
Yeah,
had any of those issues. It's very much a case of like that they bought the flat for 250 or 300K, and then they
yeah,
accept the fact that there is a freeholder somewhere and they pay a service charge,
yeah.
and I'm sure 9 times out of 10, then the freeholder, the landlord, is an admirable human being who does,
Oh, it's definitely not
is it
nine
not?
times out of 10. We've got a huge. I mean, literally 1 in 4 properties now are leasehold in England, I think, or England and Wales, one of the two.
Yeah,
And that's literally 20% of our housing stock. So we've got the same amount of leasehold property as we do socially rented, council housing stock or housing association that's pure
right.
rent. It's a huge proportion of our market. But the thing is, back in 2016, my old MP, Jim Fitzpatrick, spoke in the Commons. He believed, based on which data, basically that 1.6 billion pounds of overcharging on service charges a year,
Mm,
and it's going to be way more than that because the growth of
mm,
leasehold. Literally, if you want to buy build an apartment block, it has to be leasehold more or less because common hold's not taken off. The law in that area is
mm,
deficient. It doesn't really work with shared ownership
right.
properties. Doesn't work on mixed use. If you might have a hotel or some shops below, it's not going to work on that. So that's most of Manchester, Leeds, and London now because there have to be mixed
Yeah,
developments. But the thing is that the system relies on you having a good landlord. But the reality is that you don't really need a landlord
yeah,
because what we've seen with the Grenfell, post Grenfell scandal or building safety crisis, some people just call it cladding.
yeah,
Basically, these building owners that in the good times they take everyone's
yeah.
money, they control everyone's service charges and their household bills. Then in the bad times, with a hit with the dangerous cladding or other fire safety issues, they say, not for me to pay. I'm just a speculator in the income streams. Well, they've got to make up their mind. 1 minute they're the building owners and they control
Mm,
everything, and the leaseholders are the tenants that have no rights really. The laws in this, we've got about 16 or 18 different bits of legislation. It's all been sticking plastered over many
mm,
years. The reality is that successive governments have wanted to move away from leasehold,
mm,
but the big landlords and the big developers, the Duke of Westminsters of this world,
right,
very, very well financed, they fight tooth and nail to resist meaningful change in this.
right. So let's drill into this a little bit, right? So if I'm
Yeah,
a developer, and I buy a plot of land in West London, and I
yeah,
decide to build 500 flats on top of it. Um,
yeah.
why? What's the bonus for me? What's the kickback for me if I make all of these properties leasehold? And how do I even do that? Because like, wouldn't I be thinking, right, I've got 500 flats, I'll just sell them all, like,
I move on with my
yeah,
life.
everyone owns the freehold. Like, why do I have
No,
to?
so a lot of that, yeah. I get what you're saying, and that's what like a normal person would think, on the street. You'd think, okay, that makes sense. And they clear off and they're on to the next
Right.
site and build more houses or more flats. The reality is that there are two options at the moment, or three if you count the really terrible common hold legislation that we have on the books. You can do standard leasehold,
Yeah.
or you could do share of freehold or common hold. Now, with leasehold, why most developers go with leasehold is it's everyone knows how to use it. You draft the leases in a way that benefits your own interests. So you'll get lawyers to draft leases. We saw a huge scandal with ground rents a few years
Mm-hmm.
ago, where these ground rents were doubling every 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
The banks were falling asleep on the job. So they basically were lending against these products. And then the work of Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, but also a great campaign group called National Leasehold Campaign, run by these three amazing working mothers, basically, that bought leasehold houses, and there were ground rent issues there. That actually then made the bank scared and then withdraw mortgage support for these, whether they're houses or flats, with these crazy doubling ground rents
Yeah.
that would make, there's a story even in the Daily Mail, say the Daily Mail, but there we go. They've been really good on this scandal in the last year or
Mm.
so, especially with cladding, but even on ground rents. there's a lady in South London who's got a one-bed flat. It's one of those sort of maisonettes that have been converted, and unfortunately, she's taking action against her solicitor or
Mm.
whatever, because basically the ground rent that was snuck in there basically was going to keep doubling until it gets to about £1 million
Really?
in, I think, 50 years' time. So the reality is that leases or any contracts, those that draw them or get them drawn up, those contracts inevitably benefit those that are behind them,
Yeah.
never really the consumer. So the thing is, why a developer would go for leasehold is not only will they sell the
Mm.
flats, and I say sell inverted
Mm.
commas, because they're basically only selling the right to occupy those flats for a set number of years, but they get the freehold as well. So they're splitting the land, so splitting the kind of land from the flats, as
So
it
does
were.
wait. So does the developer hang on to the freehold?
So the developer hangs onto the freehold as a way of potentially either keeping the freehold, like certain developers that I'm not going to name here tonight because I might get into legal
Yeah.
trouble. But basically, there's some big developers where they'll keep hold of the freehold, and we'll wait for a second on that. But many will keep hold of the freehold. They'll sell the flats as leases without a share in the
Hmm.
freehold, so that, or even a resident management company. A resident management company would basically mean that the leaseholders are still leaseholders, the flat
Yeah.
purchasers, but they would at least control the managing agent. So many developers, all they'll do is they'll keep the
Yeah.
freehold, they'll sell all the flats, leaseholds,
Yeah.
or on leases, and then they'll find some private equity investor, maybe in Monaco or the Cayman Islands, or maybe UK
Yeah.
based, to basically they'll sell that freehold, which will be worth a lot of money because it has something called a ground rent
Yeah.
attached. So each flat will have to pay a ground rent normally in modern days. Before, the ground rent used to be called something called a
Right.
peppercorn, which means literally zero financial value. But when you have a value on it,
Yeah.
it basically means it's a lucrative income stream for an investor. So most of these developers, they would then sell the freehold on, and someone would get the freehold, they'd get the ground rent
Hmm.
income. But what wasn't said and what wouldn't be advertised in public is you've got all these other income streams. So you've got placing the insurance the freeholder or the landlord has to
Mm.
do, and they can do it with a broker or a managing agent, and then they can make a commission. So commissions can be as high as 60%,
Mm.
on average 40%. So leaseholders are paying for something that it's not really a service.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's commission. It's a horrific immoral practice, and it
Yeah.
goes on because the laws aren't there to really force that disclosure. Leaseholders can go to tribunal and waste their lives basically trying to get it,
Mm.
but it means you've kind of got to have a legal background or be an accountant basically. So it's a bit of a nightmare in that respect.
It's
But also, many developers, they keep the freehold because they can screw people on service charge. So they can constantly increase the service charge, and there's no real rules and regulations that says once it hits a certain point you've got to stop.
there's no cap on it, really.
There's no cap. So you can literally keep bringing up the service charge
Yeah.
higher. And their understanding, and it's very, very clever, before the Grenfell situation and all the regulatory fallout from that, they believe that leaseholders are worst enemies. That's true.
Mm.
So leaseholders don't get organised. People are so scared of their property values, they don't want to speak to the media and tell their story about service charge abuse.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're scared because they don't want to damage their property
That's
prices.
another.
And you know what they want to do?
Yeah.
They want to sell the flat, get out, and leave it to someone else to sort. And the thing is, now with the cladding issue and all of the regulatory fallout of that, people have got these huge bills up to £150,000. There's a case recently in Hertfordshire where a young woman is facing, I think it's £205,000 to remove some cladding off a building she doesn't even own, for a flat she doesn't even own,
Yeah.
for a building she didn't build, for a building she didn't sign off. The whole thing's a joke. But because people have got nothing to lose now,
Yeah.
they're willing to get their hands dirty and tell the media about stuff that preceded Grenfell, where they've, even now, there'll be many blocks where they don't have any issues of cladding,
Mm.
but they've got crazy service charges where they might not have any
So
facilities
let's.
and they're paying a one bed 7,000 a year.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's rewind a little bit and bake this into a sort of real world-ish kind of example, right? So let's say I am a young professional. I'm 29. I've got my first like 40k or 50k a year job, and I want to get on the ladder. And I've managed to through scrimping and saving, I've managed to get myself enough to get the Help to Buy deposit together, right? So now I go and buy a one-bed flat that's in a block that's been built by ABC developers. And what you're saying is I would then buy the 900-year lease. So I wouldn't sort of like I would own it because there's a mortgage on it, but not really is what you're saying. It's like a long
only owning the right to occupy the
Yeah,
property.
yeah.
So, for example, if you don't pay your service charges or you have a dispute with the landlord over what he's levying you, basically and this sounds theoretical, but it happens. We estimate about 90 successful cases, 120 are brought to the tribunal, called forfeiture. So if you don't pay, basically the landlord can take the property off you with no compensation. So there's not even a balancing payment.
Really?
Now, normally the lenders get involved because their asset or their kind of investment is, they've got to protect their investment. They don't want their investment being seized by a landlord or a freeholder.
Right, yeah.
But there have been many cases where people have either been out of the country, maybe the brother didn't open the mailbox or whatever, and basically the property gets kind of repossessed
Yeah, yeah.
by this freeholder, and there's no compensation. So it's a feudal kind of windfall thing to a landlord.
Yeah, yeah.
But they use that, and you don't even need it to be successful. They use that to get you to pay whatever they want you to pay, basically,
Yeah.
whether it's a service charge, a major works demand. So the reality is that for someone, you're saying, talking about a young case study, young person, now what happens is the banks will look at affordability. When you buy into that block of flats, the developer will say, okay, one bed, the ground rent is 2,000, not the ground rent, the service charge is £2,000. So you think, oh, reasonable. But generally, most developers, particularly the PLC ones and the big name ones that you and I have all heard of, they basically underestimate or understate or even missell the service charge contribution.
Right.
So after 2 years, they time out the warranty, and then basically they'll sell the freehold on, and the service charge could
Yeah,
double.
right. So that's what I was going to get onto. Is
And
like
that goes back to affordability. That young person is already feeling underwater, and then it might double again.
Yeah, yeah.
Literally, and we've seen cases where service charges have gone up 50% in like 4 years.
Yeah. Which is,
and these are young people, literally, and their only choice is to sell, but it's already affected their capital value because no one wants a one bed. I'm in London Docklands. There's so many one beds.
Yeah.
There's a glut of them on the market. And then when you see those service charges, people don't want to touch it with a barge pole unless you really take a hit on it. Most of these young people, they can't.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose, is there some truth to the idea that specifically with one beds, because we're trying to get so many young people onto the ladder quickly, and there's always another new build block of flats around the corner, like why would you buy a new build one bed that's like 2 years old when you could just go around the corner and get like the brand new one with the pristine kit? Do you know what I mean?
It's like new car, old car syndrome.
Yeah.
Literally, as soon as it's out of the showroom, that flat depreciates very quickly.
Yeah.
It's the same with a car. You take it as soon as you've taken out of the Audi showroom, it depreciates.
Yeah.
And the reality is that people might be thinking, oh, I might be better off getting a brand new flat in a brand new block with these services. What they don't know is that those service charges are set at a very attractively a low or competitive price, and then they just get jacked up, because especially where the developer holds the freeholds, they'll impose all their intermediary companies on it.
Right.
So they know you're a cash cow.
Yeah, yeah.
They know it, and the law allows them to do it as well.
I was going to ask you a question about so in terms of sort of dodgy service charges and strange practices from freeholders. So my girlfriend works in property. They have a flat that they rent out. It's a family business, and there's a freeholder, sort of landlord company. It used to be a shop, and they renovated it, turned it into a 1 or 2 bed flat. And every now and then they get this letter through from this freeholder, saying like, this is your last warning, blah blah blah, like threatening them. And they're like, what the fuck does this even relate? And then they try and phone them, can't get through. Then another one comes through saying like, this is your final what? And they're thinking like you would, or like I would, like, oh shit, I better fucking pay this or I'm really in trouble. Like, because like you said, if you're the freeholder and you could seize that property, the inclination there.
And it's just theoretical, even if it's 90 successful a year, you've got this, there's a sword of Damocles hanging over the leaseholder. And that's psychologically has a very powerful impact, because you think, gosh, this is my property, I might have a mortgage on it. I'm a homeowner in inverted commas. No, in the law, they call you a tenant.
Yeah.
You're actually nothing more than a glorified renter. And this is what the great leasehold delusion is. Everyone's thought they'd get on the ladder, they'll buy the flat. And because we had the property boom of the 2000s, it was like anesthetic for the brain. People would then buy the flat, then they would trade up to a house, maybe in St Albans or whatever, and they don't need to deal with the leasehold issue again. And it's always a first-time
Mm.
buyer. But now we've had the whole property market gummed up, and now with the whole cladding issue, with basically 1.3 million properties basically unsaleable or
Mm.
unmortgageable, so you can't sell it to a mortgage buyer, and it's basically impacting property chains. So where someone might try and be buying a house, there's probably normally a starter flat in there. It's gumming the whole property system
Yeah.
up. So almost like subprime. The reality is that now the whole leasehold issue, people can't pretend what they used to just pretend about and shut away and sell it to the next buyer, because that's what people would do. They just say, look, we'll keep quiet on the service charge. We'll sell it to some maybe naive overseas buyer, particularly for the 2 or 3 bedroom flats in
Yeah.
London. And even the one bed, there's always still enough demand for the one bed with the first time buyers that people could just quickly wash their hands of it. But now the whole property market's stagnating, and basically everyone knows what's happening with leasehold now.
Yeah, it's sort of on an
Sadly.
industrial scale now. People, it's the first. I suppose I would liken it to, like, before all the anti-vax nonsense really took hold. It was just like a few sort of fringe lunatics might say, like, "Oh, I've heard this caused. What was it? They thought it caused like vaccinations back in the day. They thought that it caused autism, didn't they?
Autism,
And
yeah,
then, but now it's so like widespread. It's like on more than an industrial scale. So I suppose
yeah.
it's like that. It's like back in the day, a few people would be aware of it, or
That's the thing. It was very much a concern of lawyers. It was seen as a very dusty
yeah,
issue. My bosses did an amazing job. I think that LKP has been around 6 years, but it used to be an issue that even journalists didn't really want to particularly touch. They didn't see how it linked to real people's lives. They just thought, oh, it's a legal mechanism for basically apartment buildings. A
mm,
leasehold. We've had it all these many years. I mean, even when I was in the Independent, a very, very good journalist over there, he said, well, don't you have to have leasehold as a way of organising communal living? And I actually said, no, you don't.
mm,
And at the moment, this leasehold is creating an asset class in ordinary people's homes without people knowing it.
yeah,
So it's such a crazy. And then the Grenfell thing and everything that's come out afterwards, that's just, it's turned it into such a mainstream issue. But we also had the leasehold houses. So the Northwest, the leasehold model was so attractive to developers,
yeah,
particularly in the Northwest, but all across the country. They started selling houses as leasehold tenancies, basically.
right,
They might have put a dodgy ground rent
yeah,
in. And lots of people, particularly in the Northwest, many of them, they felt they had no choice but to buy a leasehold house because all the new developments, were leasehold houses. So they were told something at the showroom: look, you can buy your freehold after the 2 years in law, and it'll only be £46,000. And then 2 years
mm,
passed, and then they wanted to buy the freehold, and they were told it's off the
yeah,
market. It's been taken on by another investor, and if you want to buy it, it's about £66,000.
yeah,
Working people, they've not got that type of money. So they set up this national leasehold campaign to kind of energize the masses and actually raise awareness. Link up with Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, which has the intellectual
mm,
capital. They're kind of sort of charity, come think tank, come media organization. And they had the intellectual capital with the people power, bringing it together. And what was very clever about the NLC, developers and freeholders put enormous pressure on them to say, look, this is just a houses issue.
mm,
Try and buy them off about the houses. Oh, we'll sort out the houses. But those 3 amazing ladies, Katie, Kath, and Joe, they weren't having it. They said, look, we now know that leasehold is even more abusive in the flat setting,
yeah,
because this freeholder can controls your whole home life down to whether your windows get cleaned. The reality is that the abuses in leasehold for flats are way more than houses.
mm,
And actually, the houses, it got people's interest.
yeah.
They were locking themselves up in fake prisons, saying we're locked, we're prisoners,
That was when
basically.
I was
And it
first
got
aware of it.
Parliament interested.
Yeah, like that was when the news stories, sorry, broke about them trying to wrap lease agreements around houses. I was like, well, because like going back to my friend who bought the flat, who then explained, oh well,
Yeah,
this is why they do 900-year leases, is big blah blah
yeah.
blah. It didn't make any sense to me because I was like, well, if that's the reason that he gave me, how the fuck would that apply to just like one house based on?
To a
So it has to
house.
be a like profiteering thing, and it sounds like
It's a racket,
yeah,
basically. They were then selling the freeholds from under their former customers' feet, I guess, as soon as they left the showroom, bought their
yeah,
house. And instead of honouring what they said in the
mm,
showrooms, then either the freehold was taken off, or it was going to be, a ginormous amount of money. And you know what? Because of the work of LKP and
mm,
NLC and some great journalists outside that NLC and LKP have
mm,
briefed, basically the music changed. Parliament then launched a parliamentary inquiry by the Housing Select Committee. They did about 6 months. They hauled the developers up. The developers freely admitted it was their business
Yeah.
model without even a smile on their face. There was no irony. They thought, well, it's legal.
Yeah.
Legal is not moral. Do you see what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
then the Competition and Markets Authority got involved. And a few months ago, they've basically come to an agreement with some leading developers and freehold owners, even Aviva. So even a big name insurer like that was hoovering up freeholds to people's homes, and they say it's for the ground rent income or it's for pension
Yeah.
funds. Maybe that's true, but the reality is that everyone was piling into these freeholds, whether they're houses or flats, and it was a big, big scam. But because of the houses, that was a way in to actually, setting this debate. And then obviously with Grenfell, the leasehold structure has now come under immense scrutiny because the government for the last 4 and a bit years have been saying building owners must pay. But in leasehold law, the building owner really isn't a building owner. They're just an income, income extractor or
Yeah, like
ground rent
they've
raiser, whatever
bought
you want to
the
call it.
asset, haven't they? As you said
They
earlier.
bought the asset, but they don't really have any real liabilities as
No.
such. They're not there to pay. So the ownership is divorced from the financial liabilities.
Yeah.
So it's the leaseholder or the tenant that has to pay. And yet they don't do any of the owning, which is a joke. So they can't appoint their own managing agent. They can't basically democratically decide their own service charge budget. Yet all around the world, when you buy a flat, you own it outright. There's no building owner or third party landlord or freeholder or whatever you want to call them, ground rent, investor. There's none of that. So the actual interest in the block is to those that own the property,
Yeah.
those that pay for it. So, and with the whole Grenfell situation, the government have still been kind of hiding behind building owners even now.
Yeah.
So anyone under blocks under the 18 meters, they're basically selling out. And I'm saying this in person, they have a forced loan on them.
Yeah.
So
Well,
these are going to be low interest loans.
This is something I wanted to tap into tonight with you. Was the sort of personal impact that it's having on flat owners, because I think there's a tendency from afar to read these news stories and go like, well, worst case scenario, some people who managed to get on the ladder, who now they're flat owners and
are going to go bankrupt.
Well, I think a lot of people would look at it like they would dismiss it in a sort of, look, they're flat owners, so they're going to be making, as long as they hold on to their flat, they'll eventually
come out. So they own it,
but
they're going to have to pay for the maintenance and all of that. But the thing is about the building safety crisis, these aren't just little wear and tear bills for living in an apartment building. This is basically wide, regulatory failure, but also corporate wrongdoing, basically. So developers were cutting corners, not building buildings basically to spec and to the regulations. So they might do missing fire breaks, there might be combustible insulation, but then the government went wrong. Now the government, if we had an MHCOG spokesperson on now, they would vigorously deny that the cladding that was on Grenfell was basically allowed under regulations. They would say it was non-compliant.
Right.
But all these developers and cladding manufacturers, they say no, it was compliant with the regulations. And the problem is the government don't want to be taken to court, and the developers are thinking, right, we don't need to take them to court yet because they're not pushing the bill onto us. So what they're doing is the government are basically pushing the bill. So they say one thing and then they do something else. So they say that there's record investment of £5.1 billion. So to the guy on the street who might not read that much about politics, they might look at the BBC News site once a week and they scroll down for the sport and something might catch their eye. That sounds like a huge amount of money. They're a taxpayer. They might not even have a property. And you know what? They might think that's a lot of money, but what that's doing is I think it's between 60 to 90% of the overall bill is going to be on the leaseholder's shoulders. So it's not on the taxpayer or I would say I don't see it as a taxpayer because leaseholders are taxpayers. It's about state failure and industry failure, market failure. So we need to actually get the money from those who cocked up.
Yeah, but like
at the moment they're going to be contributing a very small amount.
So how do you? I suppose this is what I struggle to get my head around. So Grenfell happened. There was a lot of focus on the quality of the cladding, and so if I follow that trajectory and I go right, okay, the cladding was not fit for purpose and was highly conducive with creating a huge fireball in which a lot of people died. Right, so the cladding is not sufficient. Who did the cladding meet the regulatory requirements at that time? It sounds like the government would say, or the house
The
builders.
government would say it didn't, it
Right.
wasn't compliant,
But
and that's what the ministers will say as the officials. But then there's another school of thought, which the developers, the cladding manufacturers, they say no, it was
so
compliant.
why?
So the regulations were so poorly written
Right.
that they allowed the ambiguity allowed for something like that to
I
get stuck on
see. Okay,
Grenfell.
so then it becomes a question of taking it to court so that somebody.
And the government don't want to be taken to
Right.
court, so
Okay.
you can see that with their behaviour over leaseholders. They're not making the polluter pay, or they're not making those that put the dodgy cladding there in the first place,
Yeah.
either the regulator, either themselves,
Yeah.
or the developers to pay and the cladding manufacturers. And the reality is that they're looking at two different levies at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, one of the PLC house builders, I think they could pay it literally. I think they could do it all themselves. And they only 20% of their annual profits they could take. It's like a rolling levy of 10 years. It's not going to raise a huge amount of money.
No.
And the reality is the government are scared of taking on the industry.
Mm.
And obviously the industry are pushing back, and they've got a case as well. But Newsnight, there's been, Inside Housing, the Times and Sunday, particularly Sunday Times, Martina Lees, they're doing great reporting. But the reality is that who isn't responsible? It's not the leaseholders. They bought a flat, and I say bought, they
Yeah.
bought a lease in good faith. And
Yeah.
the whole lease system wasn't there for something that was so fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
Leasehold, the whole idea, it's about sharing the cost of living in a building. The service charge, it's for the upkeep, fine,
Yeah.
for general wear and tear. But it's not about huge facade and structural issues and ripping out, combustible material and wool and all. You know what I mean? It wasn't that designed for that.
Yeah.
But the government now are testing that to destruction. And because of the fallout from Grenfell, the wider structure of ownership that is leasehold is now, under immense scrutiny. And people are saying, well, hang on a second, these freeholders say they're so useful and so vital to protecting the interests and safety of these leaseholders, and that they know what's right for the building. Mm-hmm. And yet they're the same people that are on name and shame lists by MHCLG because they've not removed the cladding.
Yeah.
They don't want to pay for the removal of the cladding. And they pretend that they're as innocent as leaseholders. But my own personal view is that these freeholders have taken on that risk in a way, as buying the freehold as an investment asset. Mm. They should bear that risk of actually having to basically pay to fix the cladding. And where the government can get involved, it needs to do some proper taxes on developers and cladding manufacturers, but also think about bringing up the foreign buyers or overseas, buyers levy. Mm. The moment I think it's 3%. Singapore, many other countries, parts of Canada, Australia, they have foreign buyers levy of 15, 20%. Mm. And that will help first-time buyers get on the property market, because there's all this speculation in London and the southeast. You could easily, those that want to invest in our country's housing market, they could pay a bit more.
Yeah. Well, what have they done in other countries? So, as I understand it, when Grenfell happened, there was a sort of ripple effect overseas, and they were like, "Oh shit, maybe we need to get our own house in order." So have they handled this sort of stuff in a more
better than we have? Absolutely.
Really?
So they immediately, Victoria's probably the classic case in Australia, the state government there. They said, right, to understand the problem, we need to know what the problem is. We need to know how severe it is. So we need to launch an audit of all high-rise apartment buildings in their, jurisdiction. Right. So they went and did that. Now Scotland are going to be doing that shortly. Wales have committed to doing it. Somehow England thinks that they know it better. They've not looked at the rest of the world where they thought, right, we need to get the data on the issue. Mm. Now, what's happened is that the media has unfortunately stoked a lot of hysteria, but also the government's own so-called experts, such as Dame Judith Hackett, who was brought in to do this basically building safety review about understanding how buildings from conception to completion, but also occupation. The lady doesn't know anything about leasehold. She'll freely admit that to you. She said it to the Parliamentary Select Committee. And the report, there was some good recommendations there about a regulator and all the rest of it, and also about how developers build these buildings. Mm. We should be building these buildings, apartment buildings, like they're aeroplanes. Before something goes up in the sky, every little piece needs to be checked. Mm. And it can't just be one or two people that are saying, yeah, it's all right. And it's all this sort of devolving of responsibility downwards, and it's, all the blame shifting, that needs to go.
Yeah.
But basically what's happened is that she's written this report that implies that all apartment buildings, by their very nature, because they're multi-occupancy, are kind of like oil refineries that are waiting to go up. No. If apartment buildings don't have lethal cladding on them, and you have two fire escape stairwells for the high rises, actually building risk can be managed like they do in all these other countries that Seoul, Singapore, lots of cities where they've got high rises, they've got the right policies on them. But what's happened is that now with this building safety bill that's coming through the tracks, huge costs are going to be put on leaseholders because there's this wrong assumption that all buildings, apartment buildings, are like kegs that are going to explode basically.
Yeah.
And they need all these, extra costs and regulations and a building safety manager. What happened to the managing agent?
Yeah.
The reality is that the MHCLG, they themselves have snuck in the impact assessment that only an expert would pick up, that the extra cost to leaseholders in a 15-year period, either at the purchase stage of the situation or during the occupancy, will be between 4 billion and 8 billion.
Right.
So these are all costs. And you know what they say? Well, up to 4 to 6 billion will be non-monetized benefits to mental health. Now, I'll tell you that as a son of a leaseholder who feels completely underwater with service charges, if you have service charges that are going to balloon, that's not going to give any positive mental health benefits at all. So, obviously the government and the ministers, they don't live in these kind of apartment buildings. They don't really know about the leasehold system. And, Dame Judith Hackett was at a recent meeting of the all-party parliamentary group. I reached out to her and she said, look, I knew nothing about leasehold when I did that report. Well, that's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then she said she's learned a lot about the iniquities of leasehold. But the problem is her report and the work that she was doing and ministers and officials, they've been stoking hysteria for the last 4 years. And now people can't get mortgages out on these properties because the genie's out of the bottle. The banks don't trust these buildings.
Yeah.
They don't trust the government's regulations. So now there's a huge property crisis that goes beyond the 1.3 million leasehold properties that are directly impacted.
And it's worth noting that it's that the real world impact of this can be, and like I've got a friend who's caught up in the cladding output, if you like, in that, so she bought a place and it was effectively zeroed in value. Like they were like, well, if you want to remortgage, I don't know what to tell you. It's this place is worthless. And I was saying to her, I was like, well, then presumably that means you get to stay in it and you just don't have to pay a mortgage. And she was like, no, they still want their money. And I'm like, how do you square that circle? That it's you say that I can't have a mortgage because it's not worth anything, and at the same time you're like, I still want my money. Yeah, it's fucking bollocks. Like. And then so she's in like scenario A, right? And then there's a lot of people in scenario B, which is where they've by hook or by crook they've got onto the ladder. And I really mean by hook or by crook. Like they got 10 grand off their friend's credit card because they were like, I can give it back to you like once the capital growth goes up. And then they borrow 50 grand. Yeah, 50 grand off their rich uncle, and they're like, don't worry, I can give this back to you in a couple of years once the capital value goes at like, and we can set up a payment plan. And then this shit all happens and it's zeroed in value, and they're like, how the fuck am I supposed to pay these people back? And it is not just like bankruptcy, it's like familial embarrassment and it's financial ruin. And I'm not saying that there's no way back from it, because I've been in financial dire straits before and I've sort of managed to fight my way out of it. There's always a way, some light at the end of the tunnel. But it is you were talking about mental health and the stresses that this shit can put on you. I'd be amazed, and I'm sure you'll update me on this in a minute, but I would be amazed if there hadn't been people who had thrown themselves out of their apartment windows by now over the stress and the mental health.
And I think, to be honest, I'm involved in some of the campaign groups. People are literally thinking that they want to take their lives. Yeah. And the reality is some of them are thinking, you know what, we need another sort of Grenfell. We need a huge fire. Now, there was a fire down the road from me, New Providence Wharf, Ballymore site. Now, they are a good developer as a case study because, interestingly, unlike many others, they keep the freeholds to the blocks. So once they've sold the last flat, they still keep it. So it's a little bit like Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. You're stuck with Ballymore for life, basically. And their managing agent and lettings agent and all their subsidiary companies, all the rest of it. And people complain of sky-high service charges and unaccountable management, all the rest of it. Obviously, Ballymore would firmly deny that. But you had a huge fire there. Now, luckily, no one died. It was in the morning, so they all had a WhatsApp group, and people, kids had already gone to school by that point. But say if that was at night or in the morning, when people are sleeping, they had these things called waking watch, where you've got these fire wardens in the high-vis jackets or vests. They've got the walkie-talkie, being paid probably a little more than minimum wage. And the reality is that those guys, if I was on little more than minimum wage, I would scarper if there was a fire. And I think it was effective in the first few floors, but the top floors, they were nowhere to be seen. And yet residents there were paying tens of thousands a month for this sort of waking watch thing that the government have imposed on them. And you know what was interesting about that case is that you had a fire which, you know, the block still had Grenfell cladding on it. Now, the London Fire Brigade have said that didn't really contribute to the spread or anything like that, but they also had wooden balconies. Now, 95% of balconies in London on apartment buildings are made of wood. And the point is that you have a barbecue or someone lights a cigarette and drops it, you're in real trouble there. And you could see it. It basically escalated quite quickly. But the thing is that that developer didn't want to pay to remove the cladding. And because of the fire and the leaseholders, there was a protest that I helped organise. Within 24 hours, we had 200 people literally outside another Ballymore development that was going up with a leading Hong Kong developer. It got into Apple Daily. You know, people from Ipswich who were involved in the cladding crisis, they even came down. The thing is that these developers generally, and I'm not talking Ballymore specifically, money. And if you hit their wallets, you affect their markets over in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And that's where most of these flats are geared towards. They, you know, Ballymore is a good example. They don't really, I don't think, make any money from the Help to Buy scheme. But even those that do, they're selling a lot of their flats overseas. So there's a block down the road from me, a Marsh Wall, that's just going live. And a studio apartment is for £2 million.
Really?
Now it's for six. Yeah, it's shocking. I don't know who's got that money other than an overseas investor or maybe a Hong Konger who's fleeing tyranny, you know.
Don't you think, like,
it's
overseas?
But the thing is, they're moving from one nightmare situation to another because those service charges will spiral. And the thing is that it eats, you know, this is what we see. And many of these overseas buyers, they think that they've been told their rental yield will be so good. The problem is that after 2 to 4 years, the rental yield gets smashed because the service charges surge. And the reality is that, especially if you've just got a 1 or 2 bed, there's so many 1 or 2 beds on the market. It's very hard to keep a distinctiveness. And as you said, once they get older, you're always competing with a newer block, which might have a gym, it might have a jacuzzi, it might have a swimming pool, it might have a Zen garden. They're getting outrageous with some of these, you know, services. But the thing is that what you're saying about, you know, people, it's starting to hit them mentally. So 9 out of 10 people surveyed by the UK Action Cladding Group said that their mental health has deteriorated. It was a big study, a big survey of people. And even in terms of the financial element, I'm just going to reel off a few statistics because I think it's really important. We're looking at only 10% of the Ministry of Housing's building safety funds have been dispersed. So there's huge pile up of administration. So everyone's waiting whether they've got their government, you know, funding to get out of this misery. But alarm costs are averaging £100,000 per building. Now, impact on individual flat values are between 29 and 67%, depending on the city, which is huge. And we've also got a sample that LKP did of 110 apartment buildings with fire safety issues, found that 57% had flats that had to be put up on auction. So these are bargain bucket deals. People are just trying to get rid of them.
So is that...
And then also insurance has risen by 400% on average. So from an average of 363 per flat pounds a year to £1,447.
So,
these people are having to take on extra shifts at work. They're, you know, sometimes having to don, you know, the high-vis jacket and take on the waking watch shifts on Christmas Day, doing everything they can to bring down these costs. And it's all feeling overwhelming. And literally people are thinking they may have to jump off a bridge, partly just to end it, but also to get a news story, because we had the Ballymore fire, that was huge, but then it almost needs something, an extra push. And if that's going to be someone that does a video, you know, and then she just hurls herself off a roof.
Do you think it's just harder to make an impact with this sort of campaigning journalism now because the news cycle moves so quickly? It's like if you get something... I think that's
the case, If
you get something in the paper today,
the fire,
and then it's...
The way they moved on so quickly, they were saying literally we had about 3 or 4 days to make an impact. Once that had gone, they weren't interested. All they wanted was the actual footage of the charred flat. The problem is it was an Airbnb flat. So you're never going to get that person, because Airbnb in most apartment buildings is against the lease terms. You can't do unauthorized short lets under 6 months. So that person was never going to volunteer. But the thing is, BBC, they said we need the charred flat, we need inside. So they want blood and guts, basically, most of these journalists. And once the story's gone, it's gone. But the reality is it's the human impact that stays. And it's, you know, obviously that's a fairly affluent block. And they're now going to have all of their bills sorted for. But I think that's what's important, that you might have people going bankrupt in the Red Wall,
Mm.
but you also have people that have worked bloody hard as well down here in the south and in London, and they're just seeing their property value decimated.
Yeah, yeah.
But also on the cladding, these people feel that, you know what, they've lost all faith in their own freeholder. Now, down the road, this amazing report by the London Fire Brigade basically said that there was a lack of maintenance in that block where the fire happened, and actually the vents that are supposed to suck the toxic fumes up hadn't been maintained. And basically, I understand that they're looking at potentially even bringing a prosecution because potentially of negligence is a claim that basically London Fire Brigade, I think, made in a recent parliamentary meeting. So the reality is that it does intersect with leasehold, because these building owners, if they're supposed to be noble custodians of apartment buildings, they, and Ballymore may deny that they didn't maintain the vent system, but say if that charge is correct, they should be maintaining that for all the service charges that they're getting in.
This is the
They
thing,
should
man.
be making sure that this is a Rolls Royce.
Yeah, like you were saying earlier about like, well, it can't be both. Like you have to pick which one you are. Like,
You can't be an owner in the good times and then you're just a punter in the income streams in the bad
I'm just
times.
an investor. It's just an asset that I bought for a steady.
And I only get 60,000 in ground rent a year, and the cladding bill is, and there's a really interesting case actually, and you can Google it yourself. Beetham Tower in Manchester, really, really swanky apartment building, but it's also got the Hilton underneath. Now you had an investor in the ground rents called the Ground Rents Income Fund. They're actually on the stock exchange. I think you can buy shares in them. And basically, very interesting, they had the leaseholder. Now, interestingly, the leaseholder weren't the flat owners. They were actually the leaseholder of the commercial hotel, the Hilton underneath. And it wasn't about cladding, but it was about stitch plates on the external facade of the building. And their argument is that when the building was first built, they never had these issues. And actually, these issues affect the feel and the five-star look and feel of the hotel. And it affects their business. So they took it, and there was all this lawfare for years in all the courts. I think it went up to the Court of Appeal or Supreme Court. And basically, I think it was Court of Appeal. They ruled in favour of the leaseholder of the hotel. And they said, look, this hotel owner had or I say leaseholder, they owned a 999-year lease on the property, on the hotel. They had a reasonable expectation that the building would be maintained to the standard of what it was supposed to be when they bought into it. And actually, they forced the ground rents fund. They're saying, no, we don't care if you only make 60,000 and the bill is about 2.2 or 3 million. You are the building owner. Yeah. You've taken on that risk as part of the investment. And this is in the ruling. I'll send it to you. And if viewers want to tune in, I'll send the link as well. But basically, they've now forced the building owner. And the building owner, they don't have the money for it because it's all ground rent. And the ground rent's not going to cover the 2 point whatever million. So what's happened is Manchester Evening News has just reported that a mysterious buyer has bought the freehold for a nominal sum. Now, I'm not going to say who I think that buyer is, but the reality is it's not the flat owners at the top. So you know what? They've bought that and they've got the freehold for a bargain bucket deal, nominal, because of all the liabilities. And I think that's something where the campaign needs to look at in terms of, look, there's all these leaseholders that are going to go bankrupt because their freeholder has got this bill that they know that they can make the leaseholders pay. Why don't these leaseholders in wholly residential buildings, if the freehold is nominal, which it probably will be because you've got all these liabilities of the cladding, why don't they go in and franchise? Because you're not going to make yourself go bankrupt and you're not going to basically forfeit the property against yourself,
well,
are
can't
you?
they also
if it's a third-party investor, they'll take it off you.
Can't they use the example that you just gave of the hotel and
getting the freehold for nothing, basically,
can't they use
because
that,
of all the liabilities? They should be doing that.
Can they use that as like a legal precedent? Can they just say you've already...
Well, the thing is, because it's not directly cladding, they can't. But the principle still stands. The reality is the freehold will not be worth that much money at all. All it will be is the ground rent. And actually, if you get a surveyor in, they'll actually think, well, hang on a second, the ground rent could be nominal. It might not be a huge... It might be £60,000 a year, say that. But the liabilities of, millions and millions of pounds of cladding removal, and you might even be talking beyond cladding, you might be talking about putting in missing fire breaks. Now, in some cases, the cost of actually doing all that work, it might be cheaper actually pulling down the building and starting again. So you've got all of these liabilities. Whether you could factor that in and actually buy the freehold, something needs to be explored, because that way the leaseholders are not going to, it will be a showdown between the government and the leaseholders that are share of freeholders. They're shareholders in the freehold owning company. And that's where the major issue is. It's where the freeholder is not the leaseholders themselves. It's not collectively owned. they're the ones that are going to be demanding these crazy bills. You know, £205,000. We've got a block of flats down the road from me, £150,000 per flat. Hertfordshire, St Albans is 150. But people are still looking at 50, 60, 70, £80,000 bills. You can't borrow more from the bank.
Yeah.
And these more, you know, these loans that MHCLG are going to be imposing on people in blocks under 18 meters.
Yeah.
No one's going to want a property with, in effect, 2 mortgages stuck on it.
Yeah.
They're just not.
Well, they're just going to look at like that 1-bed flat, that 2-bed flat that's got a market value of, let's say, 300k, and then a loan saddled on top of it. Like, well, why the fuck would anyone with a brain buy this fucking place for 360 or 400k when the market value of an identical flat down the road is it could even be newer, right? Like we were saying earlier, a newer version of it and without the loan.
A newer version, and it's better with maybe more services, or the service charge is cheaper, because that's what most developers do. They suppress the service charge to lure in naive buyers and all the rest of it. So the thing is, but there are, I mean, it does sound all doom and gloom. I think the building safety crisis, what will happen is we'll have hundreds of bankruptcies. When it hits the 1,000, the government will have to slam on the brakes, you know, and it will become a new poll tax. There'll be so much widespread anger, and it will be seen as literally the party of home ownership is bankrupting homeowners. Or even now, the real cynical view could be, well, these aren't homeowners, they're tenants anyway. That's not the natural constituency of the Conservative Party. But for all intents and purposes, these people have got mortgages out on properties. They would say they're homeowners, even if the law doesn't say that. The law's not really matured.
Also, that would be a strange pivot for the Tory party to take after they've been so vociferously behind Help to Buy, and Help to Buy is all about like new builds, right? Like, I mean, you can get Help to Buy
new builds. You can only get it on a new build, basically. It was kind of literally, you have to have a new build. It has to be with one of these approved developers, and that's it. You can't have it on existing stock, which is a shame.
So here's slightly loaded question for you, right? So you mentioned earlier about like, so Scotland are a little bit ahead of us on this, and we talked about Victoria in Australia. Why do you think it is that England seem to be so sluggish on this? Like, we talked a little bit about, you know, they don't want to take it to court, they don't want to be exposed for this and this, but do you think there's
the blame game?
Is there a lobbying element to this? Feels like there might be a lobbying element.
So I'm speaking in a personal capacity here, but there's huge amounts of lobbying, and you know, basically the thing is, I think a lot of people naturally will see the building safety or cladding as a cladding thing. It's about health and safety. But the reality is that it's actually a leasehold scandal. So leasehold, we're talking about billions of pounds flowing out of ordinary people's homes. Now, if you look at the history of leasehold, literally this goes back to 1066. William the Conqueror, trying to avoid a revolution, he nicks the land, but he then parcels it off to his mates, who then parcel it off into leases. So they've got this kind of form of perpetual land ownership. You know, and then you'll have the serfs, then you had the Victorian middle classes in the Industrial Revolution, you know, and the descendants of William the Conqueror were uniquely well placed because they've got a monopoly on land. Land is capital. That's really important, you know. You know, when we talk about capital values, you know, rental yields, you can do so much with land, and you can extract so much wealth out of land. You know, there's so many other countries.
Imagine for a second.
They talk about land rebellions, but here we've been really backwards on that. We've given the vote to women in the 1900s. You had the creation of the Labour Party with the trade unions, and you know, the Sydney and Beatrix Webb and the kind of elitists of Labour bringing together. And you know, they talk about enfranchisement. It's all really interesting because that's tied in with our sort of development of democracy. But land was something that we never really quite got our heads around. So Lloyd George, great, you know, liberal reformer, chancellor, then prime minister, you know, down in Limehouse, down the road from me, he did a great speech, and he was saying, look, leasehold, this is not business, this is blackmail. He said, anyone that knows about law, they can read these leases and they know it's a racket, and we need to sort it out. And he tried to push this people's budget that would have basically tried to start the ball rolling on sort of a move away from feudal leasehold. And obviously it was voted down by the Lords, and you know how the story went. But the thing is that every 10, 15 years is a great push for the laws to be changed. So in the 60s, Labour were trying to give the right to buy, as it were, before Thatcher and the council houses in the 60s, to leasehold house owners, because you had mining areas where maybe the mining company would own the freeholds, and they would lease out the houses to the workers. Right. So that was a really big step in property law. And then, quite interesting, there was a series of scandals in the 1980s. Now, it wasn't in working class kind of Labour areas. It was in sort of Kensington and Chelsea, and it was in the kind of more kind of
affluent,
upper class, kind of Tory inclined bits of London. And you know what? They felt they were being absolutely rinsed on service charges. They had unaccountable managing agents and freeholders. And you know what? They were angry with Margaret Thatcher. And they said, we're not giving you our vote in 1987, Maggie, unless you sort out this leasehold business. So she commissioned a report, Lord Alger's report. He said there's big issues of leasehold in terms of who's doing the paying, but who's then ordering the contractors around and ordering what works need doing. There's a divorce between the financial obligations and the owning. That needs to be sorted out. But she then passed a law just before the 1987 election. I think there is a reason why the Tories are one of the most successful political parties in the sort of Western or democratic world. They're in power longer than many other sort of their counterparts. It's because they're ruthless for power. And she passed this law to allow, so it's a Labour idea of basically compelling someone to sell their property to you, you know, and the private citizen, they don't get a choice over it. It's compulsion. She applied that to flats.
Right.
So as you could demonstrate a naughty boy in the court, you'd get an independent court-appointed manager. You know how hospital or a council might be corrupt and they put in commissioners, same sort of principle. So you basically have a court-appointed manager. He's not there working for the landlord. He's not working there for the leaseholders. He's there for the best interest of the estate. And he's there to manage the building for as long as you like. But 2 years, after the 2 years kicks in, you get a right to buy the freehold. And the guy, whoever he is, however much money he's worth, it doesn't matter whether he's in Bahamas or Birmingham, it doesn't matter. So you could buy it. And then a few years later, scoundrels were still carrying on with leasehold flats. People said, look, it's such a rigmarole. We need something easier. We need a no-fault right. John Major and a guy called George Young, who's a sir now, who's in the House of Lords, who was written off as a Che Guevara by the Spectator. They said he was a Che Guevara.
Right.
He was, you know, Marxist, compelling this sort of land sale. They turned it into a no-fault right. And now all these years later, the new Labour government in the early 2000s, they thought, look, common hold was supposed to be the thing in the 90s. Now there was a Tory party that was divided by Europe, you know, and that's kind of what we've had for the last few years here. So they weren't able to get common hold on the statute books. So it's left for New Labour, and New Labour in opposition said they wanted an end to feudalism. But unfortunately, even Labour, basically there's a report on leasehold knowledge partnership by a veteran activist called Shula Rich, writing up her remarks. And she said she was in this meeting where the basically leasehold advisory service at the time, taxpayer funding organisation, was told by the Home Builders Federation or one of these sort of pro-sector groups, look, if you force common hold on flats, we'll never build a single flat again. Well, we just won't build. You must give us a choice. So then it was kind of the officials, I think, and the minister, it was kind of like, oh, we won't have common hold then. We'll just have it on the statute books. And Lord Charles Falconer, in a Labour Party fringe meeting, said, look, that was a bargain. We'd have common hold theoretically, but we wouldn't mandate it. We wouldn't ban ground rents. It would be there just for show. And all these years later now, because of all the scandals, whether it's leasehold houses, ground rents, building safety, and the missing freeholders that don't want to pay for their own buildings, all of that now, there's real interest in common hold. And you've even got, you know, whatever you say about the West Ferry, you know, Richard Desmond, you know, corruption scandal down in Docklands, you know, and maybe cash for access that's going on in the Financial Times and the Times and Sunday Times newspapers about the donor class potentially wielding too much power over policies that affect normal people. The reality is that, interestingly, supposedly Jenrick has been really driving, Robert Jenrick, the housing secretary, this common hold. So he gave a speech in Parliament recently saying, you know, and the thing about Conservatives is if you say stuff is radical, they get all scared. Like Jeremy Corbyn said everything was radical, everyone's scared. I think this country naturally is a small c Conservative one. As soon as you start saying it's common sense, it's basic, common hold is around the world. This is what Robert I can't believe I'm singing the guy's praises, but there he is, and he's saying, look, it's ubiquitous around the world. Most of the common, you know, common law or English-speaking world, you know, Australia, New Zealand, America, Singapore, Malaysia, they all have common hold or forms of common hold. And that means that the flat owners, they own it outright. They, at the annual general meeting, will decide what they're going to be paying for the next year in concert with the professional managing agent. If they think their professional managing agent is a crook or corrupt, they can then boot them out. It's easy.
The problem with that,
it's democracy.
The problem with that is that we have this real sort of endemic culture of exceptionalism over here. And if you suggest to politicians, and let me be super clear about this. I've never suggested anything to a politician. Like I'm just a guy that does a podcast, right? But my impression is,
Are you more than that?
oh, well, thank you. You're too kind, Harry. But I get the impression that if you suggest things like this, particularly to the current Tory government, that this is how things work in the outside world. Yeah, this makes sense. This is efficient. What you actually get back is this sort of feeling of exceptionalism, this feeling of like, well, we're Britain and we do it our way, you know.
But I think there's ways of crowbarring in the arguments about, we had this whole referendum about take back control. Well, there's nothing more about taking back control as democratizing home ownership and actually making sure that our homes are our own. Because at the moment, people are working so hard to get on the property ladder, get a mortgage. But even once you've paid that mortgage off, and people really, when the penny drops, they can't believe what they've signed up for. Even once they've cleared that mortgage 30, 40, maybe even 50 years later, they don't own the property. They own a tenancy agreement. They own the right to occupy. They're not the owner. Yeah. They're not the property owner. The law says that. And the Law Commission have done some great reports on leasehold and commonhold reform, and they've been really honest about it. They said, look, it's not the same as outright ownership. You've got a landlord, you've got a wasting asset. You don't have the control that you would expect of being a homeowner. And the reality is that the Tories at the moment are obsessed with Australia. You've had the trade deal that's been signed. They're talking about getting some of their meat on the British barbie and all the rest of it. But the reality is that this is what's quite interesting. Why don't they look to Australia? And Labour, under the new Shadows Housing Secretary, Lucy Powell, she did a piece in the Times, I think, very clever, saying, look, if we love Australia so much, why don't we look at what Victoria's done over the building safety crisis? Let's do it. Let's not leave it to the market, because all these guys are going to find ways of putting on commission on the taxpayer. They're not that interested in solving the crisis. They're there to profit from the crisis as much as they can and minimize their liability. And actually what you need to do is a whole of government approach where literally you have kind of a delegated task force of experts. And actually, when we say experts, not someone that knows about how to construct a building or is involved in engineering that knows nothing about the residential tenure and how the bills work and how managing agents work and all the rest of it. You need someone that's you need a lot of people that are experts. You need people that are there that actually know about what this is going to mean. Because at the moment, we've got the situation of make these buildings safe without realizing that the end person that's going to be picking up the tab is the leaseholder. And yet they have no say or control over the bills. So, they've basically been pushing, and I'm, Labour, I've not got a horse in this race, but they've been saying, look, just copy Victoria, because they've already got an oven-ready deal. You just copy a lot of the same principles and apply it over. Same with Commonhold. But Robert Jenrick, as to his credit, he's now got that Commonhold, is potentially the way of, saving the Conservative Party's home ownership credentials. They obviously need to move on building safety and cladding, because we're going to have lots of bankruptcies otherwise.
It would be a great way of him saving his own integrity as well. I mean, and
actually deflecting from some of the scandals that has basically ensnared him, and it might help him move on to a better post in cabinet. The reality is that, but the problem is that there's so much money in other people's homes. Maybe a form of watered down commonhold, or we might get commonhold on new builds, but the big money is still in the leasehold at the moment. And for all of those of us, like my mum, we're going to be stuck with kind of unscrupulous freeholders for forever. And actually the laws might not really help us to really break free from hold.
I suppose what amazes me, it amazes me and yet it no longer shocks me, is that within the upper echelons, the circular boardroom tables of these house building companies, and again, look, I don't know anything for a fact. I'm not libeling or slandering. There, exactly. I'm just suggesting, playfully speculating that maybe on the 27th floor of Barratt HQ or wherever, or Michael Shanley Homes, maybe there might be conversations floating around where they say like, yeah, look, should we build like 1,000 new flats over in this area, in this land that we've acquired? And somebody else says, yeah, that sounds good. Okay, well, what's 1,000 times like whatever they're going to sell it for? That's our profit. Okay, wicked. And then we'll employ a sort of management company to take care of the, keeping the place maintained, and then that's our. But then some guy just like puts up his hand and then says like, "Oi, what if we sold off like our responsibilities to just some like private equity thing as an asset in its own. But then they would just, I mean, like they would shirk their responsibilities. But like you would imagine that that sort of
That's the thing.
conversation would
But that's the
arise.
business
Like,
model. They literally, you go back to that parliamentary select committee, the
yeah.
housing select committee, and you've got some of the big bosses literally admitting, yeah, their policy is to sell the freeholds from underneath their feet. And you've got Bob Blackman, MP, a Tory MP for Harrow West, Harrow East, I always mix them up. And he's just flabbergasted. He can't believe it. He's
Yeah.
like, this doesn't sound right. And the thing is, what's legal isn't moral.
Yeah.
So this whole system, we've got about 16 different bits of legislation, and every time our MPs try and reform leasehold,
Yeah.
it's just sticking plaster upon sticking plaster. It doesn't get rid of the fact that you've got a landlord and tenant relationship, and for as long as you have a landlord
Yeah.
that's controlling the service charges, you're always going to have issues
Yeah.
with you. Then they're sweating the asset, pocketing the fees, making the building run down. That affects your capital value. It affects your rental yield. Renters don't want to live in an apartment building where the taps aren't working or they can't get a shower
Yeah.
because the pipe systems haven't been
Or the lawn hasn't been
working
mown.
well.
It's probably a super.
That's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing, or the building's not been maintained. So, and you know what? Also, it will affect your rental yield when the service charge keeps going up. You're not going to be able to get what you used to get for that property because you're having to cover. And renters should be really interested in this leasehold issue because those service charges do find their way into the rents.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's only so much that the market can absorb in terms of rents, but landlords will try and up the rent to try and cover themselves with the service charge that goes through the roof.
It reminds me of there's a scene in The People versus O.J. Simpson, that American crime story series where
Yeah,
the lawyers are all talking to each other in a room out the back of the courtroom or something, and then I think Sarah, can't remember her surname now, but the actress that plays the prosecutor is just like, look, he had previous, he beat his wife in like 1981 or something like that, and then the defense attorney says like, yeah, I mean, like technically it wasn't illegal to beat your wife then, and then like she goes like, you realize you just said that out loud, like that's and it's like that.
But that's the
difference.
thing. There's such a disconnect, isn't there? So I was in a meeting recently with a developer, and I won't name who because I'll get into probably lots of trouble. But I mentioned this common hold concept, and he said, "Cute little concept. The rest of the world does it." But he said England and Wales will never let go of the drug of leasehold developers. And he also said lawyers benefit so much from leasehold because it's all these little bits of paper. There's a lease here. Even in an apartment building, you'll have so many different types of leases, even within the same development. You might have one set of leases with a ground rent of a certain amount, and then because someone bought a load of flats in one go, might be an institutional buy-to-let, landlord, they were able to get the ground rent at half the price. So, but you've got the problem is the beauty of common hold is that once you've seen one common hold agreement, give or take a few rules about, one development might not allow pets or whatever, you've kind of seen them all. But with leasehold, they're all different. They're not standardized. And the lawyers are needed to unravel the complexity of it all. The lawyers are needed whenever there's a dispute. Whereas in common hold, you're going to have residents fighting like rats in the sack. Absolutely, that's the nature of human life and communal living. When you put a load of people together in one property, they might have different interests. But the reality is they don't have different interests. They all want to sell their property for what they got it for, or even more. So if you don't maintain the building and the building becomes a slum, capital values go down, rental yields go down. So, and the reality is then, even if they're deferring major work schemes, they then start doing it, or they'll get the better managing agent in. So enlightened self-interest eventually does kick in. Whereas here, we may want to do all sorts of things with our building and have our service charge even higher. Don't think we would in our block, but we've not got the means to do that.
Yeah.
Because we've got some guy in Monaco that we can't control. We've pleaded with him to meet his representative down on earth. We'll never meet his guys. All we'll meet is a managing agent who's saying on a lot of issues, we don't do that. We don't place the insurance. We don't deal with the utilities. We just stick it on your service charge. And managing agents aren't regulated either. So I could tomorrow set up a managing agent company. I could have a criminal record. The following day, I'm money. Now, you tell me anywhere else in the economy where that's allowed. It's completely Wild West. I wouldn't even call it capitalism. It's literally like extortion racket. Some of what's going on in leasehold, whether it's managing agents who know the laws are really crusty and dated on this. And, the reality is you could be found guilty by a tribunal. A tribunal is not a court.
Yeah.
They've not got the resources to go on. And it's all about the individual little cases. It's not really you don't have a license to operate. So it could
How
be anyone who can handle all this money.
how standard would you say the the practice of just hiking service charges and ground rent, or that sort of racket, like you buy it for this figure but then you have to factor in it's going to double
And
every
the
five
thing is, it's a shame because it all goes back to data. And if the government don't want to collect that data, it's very hard for kind of small, charities or campaign groups to collate it. But I'll
Yeah,
go back to that thing about Jim Fitzpatrick. He was basing on which data, which only assumed 2 million leasehold properties. Now, we understand there's about 6.5 million. But
right.
at that time, it was 2 million leasehold properties. They had already, Jim Fitzpatrick, my old MP, had bumped it up to about 4.5 million, say, leasehold properties. Now, that was, I think it was about 1.4 billion pounds of overcharging a year to leaseholders. Now it will have gone up
But
since
then
then.
what's that divided by, that number? Is that
That's a good question. But so that was when I think the housing stock, it was about 16%. So it's about, I'll get the thing up now because I've got it here. But the thing is that there needs to be way more research and data into it. There
mm.
needs to be audits and surveys and all the rest of it. Let me get it up here.
Well,
So
it's
here we
fine.
go.
Yeah, so I was just sort of curious to know like what your recommendation is for people who are engaging with the Help to Buy or like flat buying process at the moment.
Well, the
I
thing is, I've
suppose.
got friends that are looking at buying a flat, and I'm literally, and it's such a tricky one because I've spoken to journalists about this who are leaseholders themselves, and they say if you say don't buy leasehold, you basically are saying never own a home.
Mm,
And you know what? I said it to the BBC a few years ago. Look, stay renting for now.
mm,
Stay with a landlord that you can get rid of by moving property, and especially now, especially if you're looking at London,
mm.
rents have dropped because people have wanting to get out of London and get out of the city centres. So actually, you've got a lot more power as a renter now than you
Yeah,
did before. The reality is the landlords are selling up because they're not able to get the renters anymore.
yeah.
They're cutting their rents massively because of the pandemic. The reality is, I would say, stay renting for now, save up as much as you can, and the reality is, go for common hold. Let's get this common hold on the
Mm,
statute books because there's nothing better than owning your own home. And with leasehold, you don't. So you have all of the responsibilities, all of the financial risks and obligations, and none of the autonomy of owning.
yeah.
So you're
And
basically,
control.
you know what? I say it to my mates that are around this, a bit older than me, where they've got the money together and that, they might not be working for a charity. They might be working for, PwC or, one of the big banks where they're on the beautiful, glorious grad schemes. But the reality is that they know it themselves as well, that you are, and I said to them, you are giving your checkbook
Mm,
to someone you don't know, you
mm-hmm.
may never meet in your life, and you're just trusting that they won't abuse your trust. And that's what leasehold is. You're
Mm,
basically buying a tenancy agreement, and it's all right if you can take a risk and you think, look, I might only have that flat for 3 or 4 years, then I'll sell it on.
yeah.
But if you get caught carrying the baby, whether it's cladding, whether it's build defects, whether it's snagging, or whether it's just service charge issues, and your service charges double,
Yeah.
they quadruple in 6 years, you're really in trouble because no one will want that one bed flat when they can get a new one bed flat, as I said, for brand new sparkling new flat, and the service charges are half what you've got them for. And especially if you're stuck with a one bed, there's
Yeah.
so much competition with one beds, and we see it in London Docklands. It's like the market's overheated.
Yeah.
So what I'd say is wait, because we're looking at common hold in the next year or two, but actually get involved with Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, with National Leasehold Campaign, with End Our Cladding, because you know what? It affects you now as a renter.
Mm.
Spurring service charges, it does mean higher
And do
rents.
do do you guys keep a list of sort of like approved builders and managing agents, like that
So
sort of stuff?
Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, it's the only one that's organisation out there that's got kind of an accreditation scheme, basically of, genuine, decent, people that are running businesses that know that leasehold is basically a kind of a bent system, corrupt system,
Mm,
and it's like it almost pays to be a bit dodgy. But these guys, they've actually taken a risk by actually wanting to get most of their money
mm.
from leaseholders and resident controlled blocks, and not just from developers. And some of them on the list literally will not work with developers because they don't want to be doing the developers' dirty work by covering up all the build defects,
Yeah,
timing
yeah.
the warranties out for 2 years, and then just working with the new freeholder who's some private equity guy, wherever, Monaco or Jersey or whatever, or Guernsey. They don't want to do that, and they don't want their reputation sullied by that, and they don't want to be there to play the fiddle of cranking up the service charges. They want to be accountable to the leaseholders, and they want to work for leaseholders, and they also know which way the wind is blowing.
Mm.
All of the Law Commission reforms are envisioning a world of freehold ownership, And common hold actually is a form of freehold
Yeah.
ownership, but for flats. So they're seeing it as fit for purpose home ownership. And for the Law Commission, they're saying it's either freehold for houses, and the government are banning leasehold houses going forward, and they're banning ground rents going forward as well.
Yeah.
Or it's going to be common hold for flats. And it's up for the government to decide whether they mandate common hold or they clean up the legislation on common hold, which the Law Commission are proposing, and you kind of have leasehold and common hold coexisting. The problem is that the choice will not be with consumers. Developers will still, unless they're forced to part with the freeholds, they'll do what, and this is not, smearing Ballymore or Berkeley Homes, but they're well known for keeping the freeholds.
Yeah.
That's their business model. They keep the freeholds because they believe in the custodial role of freeholding. They believe that they want the sites looking pretty with the gardens, and they might have some events that residents can enjoy with paints, face painting with the kids and sparklers and all the rest of it. So unless you force the developers to part with the freeholds, my own personal view is that the leasehold racket will keep going. So the government needs to say, look, we're going to have a sunset clause on leasehold. By 2025, maybe all new flats going forward are common hold. Then that gives enough time for common hold 2.0, people are calling it, or the minister calls it full-throated common hold. So the Law Commission should take effect. And then if there's some issues, you can iron it out in time for mandating it.
Yeah, I see. But then, okay, so let's take a slightly more, I don't know, like unicorny, rainbowy route that no doubt many Tory MPs, many House of Lords, landlord types might prefer, which is to sort of lean into this free market ideology, which is where, well, look, okay, maybe there is a big problem with leaseholding, maybe and freeholders keeping hold of that and selling it off and then profiteering with the service charges, etc.
Service charges, insurance commissions,
maybe it is rife with racketeering, but that is an opportunity for somebody like, and I'm literally pulling a name out of my arse here, right? Somebody like Richard Branson, who is well known for making a big spectacle of himself and for entering industries that are already actually quite mature, like Virgin Cola, like Virgin Airways, like Virgin Radio. Entering an industry that's quite mature and then just putting his sheen on it. Now, if he did something like he entered, property ownership with a high profile and built, I don't know, new build apartments, and he said, we know what's going on in the industry and we want to do it the right way, the ethical way. We'll just sideline for a sec that he sued the NHS. We'll just forget that for a minute. He's gone super ethical. And he decides that he's going to, loads of PR all over it, that they are not going to go down the racketeering route.
Oh, they're not going down the racketeering, but they're not doing common hold either.
Well,
they're going to go down the leasehold route, or is it up to them to decide?
Like, why? Well, I suppose it's up to them really. Like, why would they? Like, would they make sufficient money?
Some Conservative MPs would say, leave it to the market. So let's get common hold perfected. We've got the Law Commission's version of common hold 2.0 on the statute books, and then you let developers decide. Some might be more comfortable with leasehold for whatever reason. We've got rid of the ground rents, so the real gout, the real terrible ground rent scandal won't happen again. And then we're going to regulate managing agents is on the cards. We're going to make it easier, cheaper and faster to basically buy your freeholds. So even those that are on new build leasehold blocks going forward, because they've got zero ground rent, it will be less to compensate the freeholder. And there'll be a new model and formula that will mean that the costs, you won't pay the landlord's legal fees, where at the moment, if you want to buy your freehold out or extend your lease, you're paying his legal and professional, which really adds a lot of costs onto it. So they'll say, look, we've got all the Law Commission, but let the developers, or no, they won't say let the developers. They're not that silly or dumb. They'll say let the consumer decide. But the problem is, my argument is the consumer never decides. The developer chooses for them. If they think leasehold is more profitable, and they can come up with all the marketing spiel about we're doing leasehold, but we're doing 999-year leases, zero ground rent. They may even entice buyers by saying you've got a resident management company, so you've got control over the managing agent. But the reality is they could still be doing stuff with insurance commissions of up to 80%, even 100%. Who sometimes in charity, they're also doing license and permission fees. You want to change your renter, you have to pay £1,000, please. Different little wheezes. They also might lend against the freehold, so they're extracting income in another way. So there's all these different things, and I think most developers, they won't even put a resident management company in. They'll keep the freehold and they'll have the management control. So I think, you know what, this is what I would say to the Conservatives. You are the self-styled party of home ownership. You've always banged the drum on home ownership. Why don't you put your money where your mouth is and actually bring England and Wales into line with the rest of the world?
Yeah.
Because all our former colonies have gotten rid of it. And even those that still have a leasehold, you know what? It's a form of land value capture. It's a way of authoritarianism. You look at Singapore, and Singapore is a good example. Hong Kong as well. China use leasehold, but it's a way of basically controlling the commanding heights of the economy. You don't have an independent landlord or business class because they've not got access to land capital. So the thing is, but they don't. Where that you do have leasehold, you might buy a private flat, say. Now it might be a 99-year lease, but day-to-day management control is with the consumers.
Do we?
The service charge payers. So it's not our leasehold.
If
We're the only countries that have this idea that you have an investor in someone else's apartment buildings and service charge.
Do we? If I just put my tinfoil hat on for a second, do we have, or do you have a stat or like sort of percentage split over how many flats we build that are susceptible to this kind of stuff versus how many houses that are built? Because it'd be really interesting to know if there has been a sort of a swing towards building new builds where Conservative Party donors who happen to be in these big house building companies who benefit from this shit have aggressively moved more and more into an area where they're going to make a shit ton of money out of leasehold. Because if like that would be quite damning, wouldn't it?
It would be damning, but there's been scandals before. So David Cameron's aristocratic half brother-in-law, Lord Viscount or Lord Astor, no, that's it, Lord Astor. Basically, it's a lord again, but he runs Long Harbour or Adriatic Land. They're one of the biggest ground rent investors, I think, in the country. And they have been the ones that have been kind of hoovering up the freeholds to leasehold flat, apartment buildings, but also leasehold houses. So my friend Katie Kendrick, who's a paediatric nurse, does 18-hour shifts, specialises in mental health. She's been running the National Leasehold Campaign, was the founder of it with, and then Kath and Joe joined. But basically, her freehold was, and I think it still is actually, she's in the process of buying the freehold, owned by David Cameron's aristocratic brother-in-law. And they were doing a lot of the Help to Buy properties. So, I'm not alleging corruption or anything like that, but politics is all about who wins and who loses. Yeah. And the reality is that leasehold houses was an obvious scam, and it was being allowed, and it was basically mushrooming under Help to Buy. Basically, there was huge amounts of houses. But in terms of the number, I've got a stat for you here from the Land Registry. So between July 2017 and 18, it's a bit dated now, new build leasehold sales represented 44% of all new build by value, and 38% by number of properties. So there was a huge mushrooming. This is before, this is after Brexit. This is kind of before the regulatory fallout from Grenfell really has hit the new build flats market and frozen it with this sort of thing called an EWS 1 form. But the reality is there's huge amounts of money. There was a piece in the Times, I think it was something like Grenfell developers hand Tories £2.5 million since Grenfell. And there's other things. LKP's even written this. There's an insurance executive called Michael Wade. Now, Michael Wade is an insurance executive, sure, but he's also a donor to the Conservative Party. And he's been given a cushy advisory role on how to deal with the cladding and building safety crisis. And he's insisting that loans must go to leaseholders. Now, the Times, it's the Sunday Times, Martina Lees, has written that he's got a palatial, big sort of mansion house kind of thing, in the country land. But there's an element of, he wasn't elected. Why is he getting to decide? And maybe he'll firmly deny that he's deciding the policy. Maybe he's there, he'll say, just to offer advice to the ministers. But the reality is that he's given a lot of money to the Tory party. It's there in the Sunday Times. I'm not making this up. You can Google it. Martina Lees. But then people's lives and livelihoods are in the hand of this man potentially, because he's giving the advice to do loans. And also insurance companies, you could argue, are happy with loans because they're not having to pay out. They're also making lots of money potentially on spiraling insurance premiums, but that's also because they're scared of the market with the whole Grenfell. But also this issue of hidden commissions. They're allowing these huge commissions. The FCA are not really that interested in it. I don't think the CMA have been taking action on that. You know, the Law Commission, it wasn't part of their work. MHCLG don't seem to be that interested. So there you go. And, you know, people are paying crazy premiums for the cladding issues, but they may also, the premiums are so high because they've got commissions in there that they don't know of 40, maybe even 60%, 80%. You know, and insurance companies, they're not really doing anything with that scandal. They're not trying to crack down on it. They're potentially enabling it.
Yeah.
They're allowing the freeholder to place the contract with them and the broker and to siphon off the money.
So then you've got a guy who's heavily influenced and biased.
And now you've got a heavily guy who's a sector guy who's going to defend the sector interests.
Yeah. I mean, to some
and is advising to the government loans. And LKP and other groups have said, look, loans won't work, number one, because you'll completely trash the property market. But number two, what happens where you have a loan already placed on the freehold by the freeholder? So, you know, in our block, it's quite interesting. Our block, we have a loan on the freehold title. Now, whose loan would take priority? Whose loan would come first? Would it be the MHCLG loan? And also, this is interesting, it's going to be a £50 a month capped, but it's only going to cover cladding. Now, for a lot of people, cladding is just the beginning of their issues. They might have missing fire breaks. Now, the government have got nothing to say on that. They're just saying, oh, we've got the loans and the grant funding. Where anyone under 18 meters, is it 18? Yeah, 18 meters, they're not going to be able to get that grant funding anyway. So they're stuck with these loans that is just going to trash their value. But Michael Wade is saying, no, loans are good.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to announce in the budget, and there was nothing.
Yeah.
It was all gone quiet because I don't think they know how to work it.
Do you get the sense that this is like COVID and Brexit and basically every other scandal in different insofar only that this hasn't really bubbled up to the surface yet? Like this is something that is going to breach the periphery of media scandals in the coming months, because eventually, like you mentioned before, there'll be 100, then there'll be 500, 1,000, somebody will jump out a window.
I think when the numbers start coming in, because the media, to their credit, are already very sympathetic. You even have, for example, the Spectator magazine, you know, back in the 90s was slagging off the Tory government for introducing this right to buy or collective enfranchisement, saying Sir George Young was a Che Guevara. There they are really leading on this. They've done some great reporting, opinion pieces, letters pages, all the rest of it. They even did a cover saying, I think it was like the New Build Mafia or something like that, about this cartel of PLC house builders restricting supply, you know, just making sure that these houses and flats are as expensive as they are, hoovering up the freeholds or keeping the freeholds. It's all, you know, all quite murky stuff. And they are saying, look, party of home ownership, they're now basically washing the hands of all these people that are probably naturally Tory inclined voters, you know, potentially people that you could win, you know, in the olden days. And now they've been completely radicalized against you. I mean, they even have amazing journalist there called Emma Byrne, but she's actually personally affected by the cladding and building safety crisis. I mean, the Telegraph, that's another interesting one. Only about a year or two ago, they were saying, to undermine the Law Commission reforms, that we have to be fair to freehold owners. So these are sort of offshore kind of speculators. And now they've got a cluster of amazing journalists that are really pushing every day on stories about leasehold, cladding, service charge use, all the rest of it. So all of the centre-right newspapers and magazines, the Daily Mail, they were the ones partly that, you know, the government are the most scared of the Daily Mail and also the Telegraph, but really Daily Mail, they were the ones that managed to get a load of more money into this building safety fund. They've been really pushing on this. So the media are sympathetic, the BBC, everyone, but the problem is we've not got enough of the human interest stories of people actually going bankrupt. So there's a lady up in the north of England, lovely young woman, I think 27, 28, called Hayley Tillotson. She had an initial burst of media publicity, but she's over in Leeds. She's bankrupt now because of a government policy. That's what it comes down to. I think she's going to come down to London. And the reality is that there's going to be more Hayleys. And there probably are more Hayleys already out there that are too shy to do media. And they're thinking, no, I don't want to talk about my sorry tale. I'm a bit embarrassed about it.
Well, it's like you said earlier.
But she can't open up a bank account. She can't get a mobile phone contract. There's implications for relationships there. You know, it's huge. We're going to ruin people's lives. But I was speaking to a journalist recently. They were saying, look, is it more of a poll tax or is it more of a bedroom tax? Because a bedroom tax, it was horrific for those that were being affected, but it didn't really shift the political dial, didn't really bring down a government. Whereas the poll tax, there was something just so unfair about it, but it affected more people than the bedroom tax. And it actually did kind of bring down Margaret Thatcher, changed policy in the end on John Major. So what is it going to be? And I'm thinking at the moment, maybe it's more of a bedroom tax. But when the bankruptcies start happening, and I don't think you really ever got major kind of mass bankruptcies of the, even though it was horrific and pernicious, you didn't really get that. And also it wasn't affecting sort of Tory voters. It sounds terribly cynical, but it wasn't. And now you get Tory voters, and over in Amersham and Chesham by-elections, quite interesting, there was a trend that wasn't picked up. There were some people there that voted for the Lib Dem candidate to give the Tories a bloody nose because, as you said, you've got friends that scrimped, saved, sweated to get on the property ladder. The reality is that big thing of people getting on the property ladder is a bank of mum and dad. Now, there are lots of mums and dads out there that help their kids get onto the property and ladder in London, but they're being affected too.
Yeah.
And they were down in Cheshire and Amersham, and one of the guys wrote into, I think it's called Peter Wilcox, into the Daily Telegraph. He said, I cannot vote for a party, and I've voted them my whole life, that want to preserve this feudal leasehold system that basically sucks money out of my daughter, but also aren't doing anything honourable on the building safety. So I think if you get it into about basically dignity and being honourable, and a government that's supposed to be for party of homeowners that said one thing, we're going to protect all leaseholders, and then the next minute we're forcing loans and making them bankrupt, I think that can transcend even those that are not affected by it directly.
Yeah. So this is something that I've been tapping into on a couple of podcasts and a couple of TikToks and stuff. Is the thing with the, it sounds like with the cladding and the leasehold scandal, but it's also true of the housing crisis more broadly, in the sense that this is a problem that originally the perception was, oh, it's just hitting people who are on low incomes. It's just, you know, oh, it's the girl that works in the chip shop can't get a mortgage. Well, boo-hoo.
Equity trap anyway. We've not really got much sympathy for them. If they can't afford to buy outright, they shouldn't be buying at all. So that's the mentality.
The problem with that is that as we don't solve the problem of, like, say, supply and demand and building enough houses and building enough suitable houses, the problem actually starts to bleed out into different demographics than the ones that we originally didn't have an awful lot of sympathy for, electorally speaking, right? So then you get into a situation where it starts to affect the people who are just starting out in their careers, the sort of, I don't want to use the phrase like lower middle class, but kind of, you know, like the
mobile basis, they might have a degree maybe or whatever.
Right. Like you'll have a sort of, like, you know, a team leader in an estate agent, or you'll have you know, the duty manager in a bowling alley or whatever, and they're earning, like, let's say 27k, 30k, and it starts to trouble them and frustrate their ability to get a mortgage. And even then, a lot of people would be like, well, you know, when I was 27, I just kept my head down and I saved, and it wasn't easy, but blah blah blah.
And stop eating the avocados and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that's all fine, well and good when you're just talking about a boomer electorate from the ages of, let's say, 60 up to 80, because they think back to their youth and they think, well, it wasn't easy for me, but, you know, I somehow I managed it. And we're just talking about people who are at the beginnings of their careers. The problem comes when we get into this demographic of middle class earners who buy the Telegraph, who buy the Express, for
the Times, the Sunday Times, all of that.
And that includes and engulfs journalists and the sons and daughters
That's
of
why
politicians.
they're covering it, because the journalists are being affected personally now in a way that they may not have been 3 or 4 years ago.
Precisely, yeah. And you're talking about surgeons, you're talking about GPs. We know a fucking GP. Like, we lodged in Peckham for just over a year at my girlfriend's parents, and, like, while we were saving and, you know, trying to sort this place out. And there was a GP there who had, like, 4 kids, and he was still fucking renting. And he can never dream of buying a house, so I'm told. You know, I didn't speak to him personally, but he was a sort of, you know, family GP friend of my mother-in-law's. And when it comes knocking on the doors of traditionally middle class or, like, upper middle class incomes, that is when a party in government, like the Tory party,
is doomed.
And I say this specifically of the current Tory party because of the attributes that you've attached to them, where we're talking about the party of home ownership.
And build and all of this. Build, like, back better and all of this stuff.
And help to buy. And, you know, how many fucking years have we talked about, like, well, house prices are getting a little bit crazy. What can we do about house prices? How are we going to get people on the ladder? But it never, ever, ever seems to result in sufficient house building that the value of it is tempered or stalled in any way. It just seems to be like it's like the value of houses and flats in London was tempered slightly by the pandemic for the reasons that
Yeah.
you laid out. People want to get out of the city. There's
They
more
want more
work from
space.
home.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But over the last 20 years, and let's, we won't discount new labour in this. New labour failed
House
spectacularly.
price growth was just obscene.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's been this huge sort of generational property dividend by the boomer generation. It's not their fault, but they are beneficiaries
Yeah,
of it.
yeah. It became their pension. Fair
Yeah.
play to them. Yeah.
They were in the right place at the right time, and now they've made hundreds of thousands of pounds. And I always joke and say, like, I mean, really, Mum, that's the money that I'm now expected to front for a fucking deposit. So how about a sub?
Right.
But
Right.
I mean, I am joking. Like we're fine. But yeah. So I suppose my point there is that traditionally this was a problem that was easily dismissed as a problem of the working classes, and now it's a problem that is knocking on the doors of Telegraph journalists that you mentioned and Times.
And wages haven't caught up with the house price sort of inflation or growth. And the thing is that I was reading recently about there are more people have paid off the mortgage than actually have a mortgage on a property. So there's a huge issue there in England, basically, where most people that are homeowners, they literally are better off. They've cleared the mortgage over those that basically, have just started their journey on home ownership. But the thing is, another thing, you're always going to let people down if you want to build more homes. And you've seen the war over planning reform.
Yeah.
Now, my personal view is I'm not sure I love it anyway, because basically it's going to be, people are saying it's a developer's charter and all the rest of it. But the reality is that developers will go into where it's profitable build and sell. So they're going to start dumping more of their cheap houses in St Albans, parts of Hertfordshire, which are very attractive for people to live in, especially post-pandemic. And they're going to have much better markups there than in London, where it's a bit of a nightmare trying to develop the land and buy, compulsory purchase or, compensate the landowners and all the rest of it. The reality is that, and there's been a big backlash in places like Cheshire and Amersham, but lots of parts of the south, because people might have had a green field next to their house.
Right.
They don't want that just being automatically turned into a load of houses or even a medium-rise block. They don't want that. And the reality is these reforms that are being pushed through, basically there's no role for the local community to try and block developments. It's very much going to be front-loaded. So as long as there's kind of a uniform look and feel to developments, whether they're houses or flats, and it's all sort of, they're talking about design codes and all the rest of it. Once that's all locked in and agreed democratically by the community, as long as the land is for development, developers can just put their, cranes in the sky and start building. So there's not really any ability for you to come back if you think you're going to have your view blocked or you're going to have some towering, imposing apartment building on top of you. There's none of that. So the thing is, there's an element of, yes, we have to build more. Yes, that's going to mean prices are going to go down. Do I think the planning reforms is kind of just going to be a kind of another wealth transfer to PLC house builders and sort of boardroom pay and shareholders and all of that? I don't think that's a good thing. It's like Help to Buy.
Yeah.
Help to Buy stoked a lot of demand.
Yeah.
It also prices up, but it didn't massively, I don't think, increase kind of output. It wasn't really increasing huge amounts of housing because it was only a new build as well. When you buy a new build, you automatically lose. There's like a new build premium of 20%. That just disappears.
Yeah.
So it's all a little bit of a fiddle, I think, Help to Buy anyway. And you looked at, was it the Fairburn guy who got a huge bonus? They're not really, I don't think they're there to, they're not charities, these guys.
No.
So what you probably need to do is more social housing. So people that maybe are not in my situation or, more middle class background situation where they might be able to live in London or, South London, kind of maybe rent free or subsidised because it's their parents' place, and then they can save up even if it's on a low income job, or maybe they're on a grad scheme and saving huge amounts because on rent. But why don't people do that in social housing? But that's because we're not building enough. And even Harold Macmillan was building huge amounts of social housing, and then it got the private sector to compete because you kind of had a standard. They were actually quite. You go down some of the blocks now, brick.
Yeah.
I know it sounds funny, but they've lasted really well. And you compare that to the new social housing
Oh
or
yeah.
housing association blocks or even luxury
So
developments, you
so
just think, whoa,
is that
the
your
quality is just different.
is that your sort of like, how would you fix this? Because I'll give you the context as I understand it, right? Is that over the last 20 years we failed spectacularly to build sufficient numbers of houses, and that has then created this sort of synthetic bubble, and the value of a home, whether it's a flat or a house, has soared as a result of that. And when I talk about that sort of generational equity kind of dividend, then that's sort of what it like. These people of a certain demographic are the beneficiaries of the soaring of that value. Now, where we're at now, it seems to me like we're too deep in the hole. In that, so where I live, a house price for a 3-bed house is somewhere between, depending on which street you're on, 3 to 400k. Right now, if somebody says to me, I'm yeah, about an hour and a quarter on the train out of London. Actually, no, it's about 1 hour exactly, and then a quarter to get into the city. So yeah, 1 hour out of London. Yeah, right. So now 300 to 400k, and somebody says we're going to build 1,000 new homes nearby. Now the idealistic socialist within me says great, people need homes. The cold-hearted capitalist Tory in me says that's really terrible because my home, the value of my house might go down because, yeah, people are going to look at my house, my 3-bed house, and they're going to say, well, I could get that, or I could go down the road and there's, new stock. Now, there's an argument to be made, case to be made there that people like older houses, and we live in a 1930s jobby. Right. They last better. They're more solid. You don't have the like new build cardboard wall cliche to worry about. So there's that. But there's definitely a case to be made that if you suddenly inject a huge amount of stock into the market, then you kill this sort of supply and demand soaring of value.
If you do, though, because if you don't deal with
Mm,
demand, and that also lots of countries, I mean, even Justin Trudeau is trying to be re-elected on this kind of foreign spec or overseas speculators
mm,
tax. The reality is, New Zealand, you've got a left-wing government there in Jacinda Ardern, who everyone that loves the Guardian, all going, oh, Jacinda, all amazing. But the reality is, she's foreign ownership
right.
of property. Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, parts of Canada, you've got left-wing governments or even right-wing governments. It doesn't really matter. It's not actually a political left-right issue. They're putting in overseas or foreign buyers
Mm,
levies. It's not about a foreigner. It's about those that are not domiciled in the
mm,
country that are there to buy property as an investment vehicle. They should pay more. And that money can then either be reinvested into social
mm-hmm,
housing or that money's there as a kind of cooling effect. So Singapore, I think they had a foreign buyers levy, or I was lucky to grow up in Singapore. They're quite interesting on housing policy, and they always have been, and they've always wanted to say that they're open to the world. It doesn't matter who you are. They're not little Singapore. They're at the heart of global capitalism. If you want to, park your money in Singapore, we'll let you with open arms. They'll even allow people like, Robert Mugabe, ex-dictator of
wow.
Zimbabwe, loads of slightly dodgy regimes to come in there and they wouldn't bat an
Yeah.
eyelid. They'd have to be happy for it. But anyway, they started, I think, at 5%. And they worked out as such a great revenue raiser. And, again, correlation, not causation, but they were generally thinking that the officials in government, actually, there was some relationship between the foreign buyers levy or overseas buyers
Mm,
levy. They called it, I think it's stamp duty, additional stamp duty buyers levy, they
right.
called it. So if you're a foreigner, well, number one, a foreigner can't buy a landed house in Singapore. You can only
That's
buy an
right. Yeah.
apartment. If you're a foreigner, you're an overseas investor. But also, if you're going to buy an apartment, so it was initially 5%, then went, I think, 10%, 15%. Now they're at 20. And they do find that that is helping because it's reducing. The reality is you've got all these Londoners here. They've not got a
No.
chance, especially on the one beds, when you've got a Singaporean doctor, or a Hong Kong dentist, and you've got everyone fleeing Hong Kong now because of the tyranny of what's going on
Mm,
over there. They're all looking at apartments. They're all looking at houses. And it's not a racist thing to say this. Literally, you've got Jacinda in bloody New Zealand. You've got Justin Trudeau, the bleeding heart
mm,
liberals, and they're putting in cooling measures to try and deal with speculation in the property
mm,
market. And it's something that it would go down really well in the red wall, 100%. But I think there's not been, I don't think, focus groups done of Londoners, but I think you'd get Londoners of all backgrounds, all faiths, all classes, all uniting behind something. And even the government now have brought one in at 3%, but 3% is so
Yeah.
marginal. It's not going to really change, shift the dial on that. You also want to obviously build more properties.
Yeah.
You are absolutely, that's a key thing. But also thinking about, and going back to leasehold, if you can potentially get a mortgage, great, and mortgage availability is there. But the reality is that if the charges are so usurious and so unregulated and uncapped, that affects affordability of the property as well. And a lot of these banks, they start getting jittery because initially they signed up to 2,000, maybe with the leeway of up to 4,000. But when they start going higher and higher, and I think you talk about the housing ladder, before people would get the flat, they'd be there for 2 or 3 years, then they'd move up, they'd move further out of London, then they'd marry the wife, they'll have the kids, they've moved out of the flat. But now, the BBC, I think it's James Peachy, the finance reported in a piece the other year that actually first-time buyers, because they're on average much older than their counterparts in the 80s and 90s and even early
Yeah.
2000s, they're actually leapfrogging flats altogether. That's related to the leasehold scandal, but it's also space. They already know that they're probably not going to be moving houses so many times. They might as well have more space to begin with. And now with the pandemic, people want more space. They want that, study if they can afford it, a spare room that's a study maybe, or with, do you see
Yeah.
what I mean? They
Yeah.
don't
So
want
could
crammed
I
in an apartment building where they're paying crazy service charge.
I'll float a couple of ideas for you that
Yeah.
like where
Quick
I
fire,
wonder
exactly. Yeah, I'd be
I
mad,
wonder
yeah.
where like housing is headed, right? So I don't know if it'll be super quick fire, but let's see how we go.
Go for it.
So
Yeah, yeah.
you mentioned about like first time buyers like leapfrogging that whole sort of one bed, two bed flat phase.
The nano flats are skipping going to houses, or they were before the
Yeah.
pandemic,
So
yeah.
I had this idea a while back, and I think I've seen a news article or two about it since that it's actually coming to fruition. But I wonder if you might think it
Okay.
industrially it would become the standard. Um, 3 or 4 person mortgages. The idea to get like right, a one bed flat is way out of your price range. So what if you got together with 2 other friends and bought like to get you on the ladder? Can you see that happening?
Yeah, but the problem is it's a little bit like getting married too young. The reality is that your kind of financial security is kind of linked to one or two other people in a
Yeah, but
way, isn't
only for
it?
like what? But I mean, we bought this place 3.5 years ago, I think, and it was always on the basis of right, we'll buy it, we'll do some work, and then we'll sell it in like 5 years. Like, and for that reason, I feel like
Yeah, and then you'll sell it and you've what? You'll stop with a
no,
mortgage or
like we'll
what?
sell it, and then the money that we've made, we might actually stand a chance of paying off the deposit that we borrowed. So like we're
Yeah,
in
no,
that
I get
situation
that.
where I was talking about earlier about where some people have borrowed money for the flats and then the flats get zeroed.
Yeah.
We're like that, but with a house. So
Or they go into negative equity, then they're in
right, if we
trap
went into
really.
negative equity, we would be fucking horse fucked, eye-wateringly over a barrel. We'd be really screwed.
And that's what happened in the 90s, wasn't it? With the exchange rate mechanism of Black Wednesday,
Yeah,
loads of people went into negative equity, huge property crisis. And to be honest, I think all of this housing crisis business, it needs to get really bad before it can get
yeah,
better. You almost need like property prices to completely collapse. So they're just putting air back into the bubble with the stamp. I know it's finished now, but the stamp duty cut. Now, unlike with Theresa May and Philip Hammond, which it was targeted to first time buyers, this was even for
mm,
anyone. So you could have even been an overseas investor. You benefited from the stamp duty
mm,
cut. That's completely ridiculous. And I was walking down some estate agents in Wapping, and in the height of the pandemic, I think it was the second lockdown. You've got guys working there that they've had sign off because it's key workers, and you just think, wow, it's a little bit like we don't really make that much in this country
yeah,
anymore, and it's kind of like housing is kind of too big to fail. It's a bit like the
yeah,
banks. So even in the pandemic, in the lockdown, we had to be saying, oh yeah, you can even not even virtually, you could go into a property generic was allowing that, and you just think, gosh, what have we caused here? And this is successive, you know governments. It's governments of all
mm,
hues. The reality is that no one have really. I think Germany and other countries, lots of people rent. I'm not saying it's a better situation, but they put their money into
yeah,
businesses. They don't put their money into property. Property is supposed to be really boring. But here we've got journalists, we've got charities, we've got everyone being experts on property because it's such a nightmare, so complex, and it's so hard. It's like snakes
Well,
and
because it's
ladders.
seen as a real sort of, the expression safe as houses is seen as a real store of value. And I don't know how much you know about quantitative easing, but as they continue to print money or sort of invent it out of,
Was pushing up the
yeah.
prices for those that
Well,
would
what was
assets.
happening was they were inventing money to then apportion and allocate to various infrastructure
Yeah.
projects or bailouts or whatever. And
Yeah.
so the value of cash was going down and down and down, and confidence in government was being diluted by the day. And so things like government bonds, where people would traditionally invest in these instruments, on the
Yeah.
basis that, oh, if I buy a government bond or I buy into a government bond, then that's my retirement sorted. I'll have a pretty good yield,
Good
yeah, in
return on
my
that. Yeah.
sunset years. And because the
The interest rates became very
right,
low though,
yeah,
didn't it? So it
so
was a lot easier
the
to
yield has
borrow.
just fucking tanked, and so this is creating a lot
Yeah.
of concern. I think in the US bond market about like, well, why would people
Yeah.
fucking buy into bonds anymore? It's in real trouble,
Yeah.
and that creates problems for us because in the UK bond market, that's where that's where we borrow our fucking money from. When the Prime Minister stands
Yeah.
up, or Rishi Sunak stands up there and goes, "Well, we're going to borrow another, 3 billion for this." That's what he's talking about. He's
Yeah.
talking, "I'm going to sell some
Yeah.
bonds to some pensioners." Now,
Yeah.
if it doesn't make sense for
And
pensioners,
that needs
yeah,
confidence.
if it doesn't
Yeah.
make sense for pensioners to buy these bonds, i.e., they're not actually going to make much of a yield out of it, they won't fucking buy them, which means we're not
No.
borrowing any money off anyone, which means there's no fucking
No.
money for government. So anyway, then they start printing all this money. The value of cash, or the perceived value of cash, disappears. And so the argument is that people with a lot of money in their autumn years have gone, do you know what's actually a better investment than bonds? Fucking
Property.
property. Yeah, so they buy these one bed flats.
Let's hoover them up. Let's have a nice big buy-to-let
Right.
portfolio. Let's do it. But to their credit, the government then started to move away from that. So George Osborne brought in, there was tax relief when you were renting out a
Yeah,
property. So they basically went on a war against
that's
buy-to-let
right. Yeah.
landlords to try and stop all of this idea of hoarding all these rental properties and actually try and allow first-time buyers to get on the
Yeah.
market. And there was a piece, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago where it was the most number of first-time buyers since the, I think, late 90s or early 2000s. I was interviewed in the BBC. It was around that time. I think that was 2 years ago. And literally, that was a huge milestone because of some of the changes that have been brought in to try and not make it financially, beneficial or viable to basically do a big buy-to-let. I mean, they would protect those that kind of, had buy-to-let properties, but those that were thinking of getting into that, they were
Yeah.
off.
Yeah. I remember.
It's an interesting one. It is really interesting what's going to happen, but I think you almost need the property market to completely be on its knees.
Before they'll.
And
Yeah.
I think with all the stuff about new build nightmares and cladding and leasehold, developers' names and trust in house builders at such a low now. The thing is, you need, I think, and not, I know some people on the left say social housing is a magic bullet, but it's not. But you need some of that to try and drive the market to set standards. You do need that, and you also need to deal with demand as
Yeah.
well.
The.
You're allowing any Tom, Dick, and Harry around the world to buy
Yeah.
property for just 3%. It's crazy. British people have got nothing against that. They don't, unless you've got bank of mum and
Yeah.
dad.
The other thing, the other sort of future scenario I wanted to market to you was the idea of, and we're seeing a little bit of this at the moment, the idea that companies would actually step in. So where the government, I mean, the old adage is, where the public sector fails, the private sector will walk in and then just
Walk in and do it better and all this stuff.
try and find a way to make money out of it and do it more efficiently. Now with housing, I had this idea a couple of years ago where I was like, do you know what? We can all agree there's not enough houses.
Yeah.
If I were a big company like Apple or Vodafone or Barclays, you mentioned your friends earlier are on the grad schemes. I did a grad scheme at KPMG back in the day. And I would seriously consider starting some sort of like flat ownership thing, like a bit like a pension scheme.
Actually, that's a good point where it's kind of like they will house the
Yeah.
workers and you'll improve productivity because I think the housing crisis is massively linked to
Yeah.
productivity. And actually, some companies do it abroad and even schools. So international schools, what they'll do is they'll own lots of property or rent it, and then the workers will go at a sub-market rate. So they've got really good, rental. But I think, John Lewis are talking about, I think they are now going in, or Waitrose, John Lewis, they're going into the rental market. You're looking at BlackRock, they're going into shared ownership and housing associations. The thing is that that's probably the way things are moving. Build to rent is another big scheme, basically, where you've got, instead of multiple different landlords, there are actually tenants, leaseholders that don't really have control over a building. You'll have one big institutional investor that owns the whole building, and then they are your kind of buy-to-let landlord, and they control everything. And then there's great rental yields over a long period of time. I mean, Canary Wharf Group is down the road from me. They've got a few rental buy-to-rent schemes. BlackRock are big into that. There's a lot of other companies that are applying into build to rent.
I think Goldman's.
I don't know whether you do. I don't think it's a great situation, because they might be even more unaccountable and unreasonable than, the guy down the street that just has one or two flats in his buy-to-let portfolio that at least you can speak to. These guys, a lot of them are faceless offshore companies.
Yeah. I mean, I don't feel totally comfortable with people like BlackRock or Goldman's buying up
No.
rental properties and then renting them out. I feel like it will be like corporations like that. If you like, I'm a big fan of looking at the various angles and corners of somebody, if it's a person, if of their character historically, to decide whether or not they've put a foot wrong now with the thing that they've just recently done wrong. So a great example of this is Lawrence Fox was in trouble on Twitter yesterday. I think he put a thing up about a footballer that was charged with rape, and because it was a black footballer, he made a link to taking the knee and something or other, and the implication there was that because he was a black footballer, that everyone should show solidarity with him and take the knee. That was my read of it, and that appeared to be the read of a lot of other people. But most of Twitter was on fire and upset about this, and his explanation of it was that actually he was suggesting that people should just be really more supportive towards rape victims, which I thought was fucking ridiculous, because if you look at the history of his character and all of his other tweets, which is more likely on balance of probabilities? Is he being provocative and racist, or is he suddenly pivoting to being very supportive of victims of rape and domestic violence?
So you don't trust these companies to be good kind of landlords?
No, because they've never done anything in the
It's
interest
about
of
ruthlessly monetizing, you could say, the asset.
A richly documented history of fucking people over and working to the nth degree of cold-hearted capitalism. So do I think they're going to suddenly, turn a corner and pivot and be some sort of socially conscious landlord and make change?
Got another thing coming. I mean, you even look at housing associations. Some of those guys act like gangsters. There was a documentary BBC Panorama called The Home I Can't Afford. And it was all about actually how housing associations operate worse than private freehold owning companies, based in Monaco, where they'll sell short leases. So they'll sell a 99-year lease, knowing perfectly well, or 125 years, that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, that lease is going to need to be extended at a fortune to the buyer or to the owner or to the shared owner. And they're playing all the angles of leasehold. So they knew that. And you had the head of...
but then this is a housing association?
This is housing associations. And even in the private sector, if I bought a private flat, most of the standard now is 999-year leases. But somehow with shared ownership and housing associations that have got an ethical role that hide behind charity law, they would literally deliberately playing the angles by doing 99, 125 years. And you had Kate Henderson, I think, from National Housing Federation. She literally was smirking all the way through the interview because she couldn't defend this practice of selling the short leases, knowing that they've got the low income, maybe key worker over a barrel. Because that person's going to have to negotiate and barter with the housing association, far better finance that will have their own surveyor, their own legal team, saying, look, extending the lease is going to cost 20k. And they're like, well, hang on a second, this is crazy. This is supposed to be an affordable product. And you know what? That documentary, and the LKP has been pushing at it, it got Sadiq Khan to change the policy. And he said, look, any money now that's coming in from the GLA, for new shared ownership properties, it has to be 990 or 999-year leases. And the government love that policy so much. MHCLG, they've nicked it, the Tory government off Sadiq, and they're applying it to shared ownership properties across the board for the new builds going forward, which is great, and for leasehold. So all new leases are going to have to be 990 or 999-year leases. So that's great. You're not going to need to extend and go through that really stressful, costly procedure.
Yeah. Well, at least that's one sort of nice positive note to
end on.
to end on. Yeah. Normally, do you know what, Harry? These podcasts, these episodes are normally about like an hour and a quarter. But I've,
Yeah, I see. I'm so sorry. Once you get me talking, we kind of talk the back legs of a hind donkey or whatever the saying is.
It's a genuinely a really fascinating topic to delve into, and you're so well researched on it and articulate, and
I'm still learning though. A lot of stuff, even about mortgage availability, I'm still learning in the different products. And I was reading about life leases and Sharia compliant property and all of this sort of stuff. There's so much. Like literally, you could do a PhD on housing.
Like you'll know this.
Housing.
You'll know this being a reporter, but it's I'm not a reporter, but I feel like I have the same sort of sensibilities of one, where I really get a kick out of talking to people where they have such passion and they're so well researched about a topic that I could just sit here like a sponge and just drink in the information
all day and have a good natter. Exactly, and learn, and it's bouncing back and forth, because you've challenged me today as well and made me think about, right, how do I explain this in a different way? How do I believe that, and all of that? Because I think as a reporter, as a journalist, you've got to report what is out there, what is the fact. But having an opinion, that's for the editors, that's for the opinion writers, the opinion editorial guys, it's the leader writers. But a reporter, you have to kind of just not really put any varnish on it or a tilt on it. It's kind of a little bit like BBC. I always think journalism, it's not about neutrality. There's no such thing as neutrality. But the reality is you're not always thinking about what do you believe. So it's quite nice today going on about what I think, because as a reporter, you have to just speak to people, report their stories, piece things together, maybe government announcements, but you're not really thinking about what you think.
Yeah.
But I definitely think there needs to be a housing crisis to really force genuine, like, pro-consumer change on the housing stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's hope.
Do you know what I mean? It's all being done to benefit the landlords and the developers. I really think that at the moment.
The only sort of point I didn't manage to get across, actually, in our chat was I felt like the freehold, that there is the dividing line in my sort of read of the situation of when you get in the immediate aftermath of a Tory election win, you'll always get people on your Facebook feed and in your friend circle who will style themselves as sort of something of a winner within a Conservative win, in the sense that they're on 50k, they drive a nice car, they're on the property ladder, they go on nice holidays once or twice a year, and they really think in their heart that they're part of this Conservative win. Right, and it's amazing to me, because it's like, if you're one of these guys in this 1-bed flat or 2-bed flat, and you're on the ladder, you got the nice car, blah blah blah, but actually the freehold there is the defining line.
That's what it is. It all back down to land capital, and it goes back hundreds of years with the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It's all going back to that. It's about land, and the reality is that I've been thinking about this even with my bosses, and we go a little bit off piece, but the party of home ownership, is it the party of home ownership? Well, they talk about the party of property owning democracy. Who's property owning democracy? Is it those of the moneyed classes? Is it of the oligarchs, of the plutocrats? Is it of the developers? Is it of the real 1%? Or is it about spreading capital? Are they the party of capitalism, or are they not? Are they there to conserve it in the hands of the few that Jeremy Corbyn, used to say that? But the reality is Labour the party of homeowners, because they've always, traditionally they have been kind of in favour of homeowners, but generally they've been more about the dispossessed, the homeless, and the social housing tenant. They're always kind of against right to buy. That was a great redistribution of power and wealth.
Yeah.
That was almost socialist in the early days. What went wrong with right to buy is that you allowed the policy to carry on for so many years that it was a way of basically hoovering up these properties on the cheap and then renting them back to the council and then screwing the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened. They didn't stop it, and they didn't use the money. Margaret Thatcher could have used the proceeds to build more social housing, but they did it as a way of washing their hands and shrinking the state in a way. But it was, you speak to those people in the 80s and 90s that managed to buy their council house, and the social mobility they enjoyed was something that Labour should have been behind. And it took the many leaders, I think Neil Kinnock, I think it got to Tony Blair where they kind of said, yeah, we accept the principle. But they should have just mothballed it at the end. But with the property, the property boom of the 2000s, they should have stopped it there. Because you hear about Tower Hamlets Council, Newham Council, all these people are just buying these right to buy properties for like nothing and then just renting it back is a nightmare.
Yeah.
But then, Labour, even the Tories themselves, who say they're the party of the landlords and the aristocracy, but they were the ones that started this kind of, for flats, this idea of you're going to force a private citizen to sell their land to another private citizen, almost maybe Mugabe style, as long as there's some compensation. It's basically stealing property in a way.
Yeah.
And that's quite almost very, interventionist in the market. So it's not always black and white.
No.
New Labour, they promised they wanted to abolish leasehold. And then when it came to it in government, they listened to the landlords and the developers and they just did a fudge.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is interesting. It's fascinating. And it's a story that I hope that we continue to expose and investigate. You in a more professional capacity, but me certainly in any
flying the flag
in any humble way I can. Yeah. But I want to say thanks very much for joining us tonight, Harry.
Thanks for having us, or having me rather. Yeah.
And this episode will be out on iTunes and Spotify. I will warn listeners of the audio podcast that I will be moving to a sort of Patreon-esque model soon. So the podcast will still be free. You can still access it, but it will be going out to Patreon subscribers first and foremost after the YouTube broadcast. So that's going to take effect in a couple of weeks. But yeah, once again, thank you so much, Harry, for joining me tonight, and to everybody else for tuning in. And we'll be back hopefully next week. All right. Thanks very much, guys.
Lovely.